Hi, guys. Tonight we step into the echoing stone corridors of a medieval castle. Torches sputter against the walls, their flames bending and snapping in the draft. The wind whistles through cracks in the heavy wooden doors, and shadows ripple across the vaulted ceiling. At first glance, it feels romantic, like something out of a tourist's dream. But if you had to live here, especially on a winter night, the illusion would crumble within the first hour. The truth: castles were cold, freezing cold. Forget rival knights and sieges. Your greatest enemy was the chill that seeped into your bones. Without central heating, double paned windows, or even a decent mattress, you'd quickly realize this fortress was less a home and more a stone refrigerator. You probably wouldn't survive the night, at least not without a few tricks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening now, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Let your breathing slow. Picture yourself preparing for bed inside this fortress of stone. Your boots scrape across flagstones polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. Each step echoes in the cavernous chamber. The cold bites at your skin, even though you're fully dressed. Those massive stone walls don't hold warmth, they devour it. Historians praise castles as marvels of defense, but never as marvels of comfort. The same walls that shrugged off a battering ram trapped the air inside, turning halls into ice boxes once the sun went down. You'd see your breath clouding in front of your face. The air hangs damp, heavy, and unwelcoming. Castles were built to keep enemies out, not to keep heat in. Architects dreamed of moats, drawbridges, and arrow slits, but insulation? That wasn't even on the blueprint. Here's a fact worth remembering. Many castles in Northern Europe were perched on windswept hills. Strategically brilliant, you could spot invaders from miles away, and the slopes gave defenders the upper hand. But as a place to sleep, a curse. The wind clawed at every surface, forcing icy drafts through shutters and under doors. A worse sleeping environment would be hard to imagine. Maybe you'd think a fireplace could save you, but no. Fires warmed only the few who huddled close. Step just a few paces away and the temperature dropped back to cellar levels. By the time you trudged toward your bedchamber, the cold was enough to make your teeth ache. And here's a quirky tidbit. Travelers in the late medieval period sometimes wrote, almost casually, of frost forming inside castle bedrooms. Curtains stiff with ice, wash basins frozen solid, and even tiny icicles dangling in corners. Chroniclers hardly treated it as shocking. To them, it was just life in a castle. If your chamber didn't gather a thin crust of frost on the walls by January, you were in the lucky minority. Yet somehow, people endured. They found ways to stop themselves from turning into human icicles. Survival wasn't just about strength, it was about ritual. As night fell, the household shifted into a routine designed to trap every scrap of warmth. Fires were banked low, conserving embers for morning. Beds were draped with curtains to block drafts. Clothes were layered one atop the other until movement became clumsy. And always, everyone prayed the wind would be merciful. Picture yourself entering a medieval bedchamber. The bed rises high above the floor, a heavy frame of carved oak. This wasn't a statement of style, it was strategy. Heat rises, cold sinks, and lifting the bed was an attempt to escape the freezing layer that clung to the flagstones. Even so, the stone still radiates chill upward. The moment you slide under the covers, the cold bites through. Historians still debate whether castles ever grew truly more comfortable as time passed, or whether later tales exaggerated the coziness of noble life. Some argue that thick draperies and wall-hung tapestries genuinely softened the chill. Others insist the cold always had the last word, swallowing whatever warmth the fabrics tried to hold. The truth likely rests somewhere in between. Better than nothing, but never the comfort we imagine. You lie back in that imagined bed. The frame groans, the straw-stuffed bedding shifts beneath you. Outside, the wind moans along the battlements. The only light comes from a guttering oil lamp, its flame shivering in the draft. Already your toes ache, though you're still fully dressed in the same layers you wore all day. And then the sounds of a castle at night drift in. The echo of boots on stone as a guard changes watch, rafters creaking under frost, a dog barking faintly in the courtyard, its voice dulled by the thickness of the walls. Somewhere in the distance, water drips into a basin, freezing as it falls. None of it warms you. If anything, each sound reminds you how unforgiving the world outside remains. It's easy to imagine nobles wrapped in luxury while peasants froze in their cottages. But here's the twist. Sometimes peasants had it better. Their cottages of timber and daub were small, their fires close. A single hearth could heat the entire room, warming every soul huddled inside. Meanwhile, nobles in their vast stone chambers might sit shivering, their wealth powerless against the cold. That irony wasn't lost on people of the time. Surviving letters from clerics and noble visitors described winter nights in castles as bitter trials. Beds looked magnificent, but sleep was restless, teeth chattering beneath layer after layer of fabric. Some even advised travelers to carry extra cloaks, not for show, but for sheer survival. As you picture yourself lying there, you begin to realize warmth was never taken for granted. It required planning, adaptation, and ingenuity. In a castle, you didn't simply crawl under a blanket and drift off. You prepared for battle against the cold itself. You layered fabrics, stacked furs, pulled curtains tight. Sometimes you even shared your bed, whether with family, servants, or the warmth of animals curled close. Every measure was about creating a microclimate, a fragile bubble of warmth inside an environment built to be relentlessly cold. The experience reshapes how we imagine medieval life. These people were not only warriors, lords, monks, and maidens. They were survivalists. Each bedtime was a test, each winter a trial. Sleep, something we now consider a casual luxury, had to be engineered carefully, piece by piece, using rituals passed down through generations. Picture the gratitude you'd feel for every small comfort. The press of a loyal dog against your feet, the glow of hot stones wrapped in cloth and tucked beside you, the rare relief of waking without frost clinging to your beard. These small victories mattered. They carved themselves into memory, far more vivid than feasts or hunts. Survival was unforgettable. So tonight, as you lie in your modern bed with central heating humming gently in the background, spare a thought for those who lay shivering in stone chambers. Their nights were long, their mornings bitter, and yet they endured. Somehow they made uninhabitable spaces livable. And that ingenuity, the layered tricks of survival, is what will keep unraveling as we move deeper into the medieval night. Now imagine yourself leaving the bedchamber and stepping into the great hall, the very heart of any castle. If the chamber felt like a stone tomb, the hall felt alive, pulsing with warmth and voices. Long trestle tables stretch across the floor, their surfaces burnished by centuries of elbows and tankards. The air is thick with smells, roasting meat, spilt ale, damp wool, and the heavy smoke that forever lingers in the rafters. At the center, the hearth roars defiantly. Flames leap upward, staining the ceiling black, casting a square of orange light against the winter dark. After sunset, this was the castle's refuge. People gathered not only to eat, but to absorb as much heat as they could before returning to their icy chambers. Servants hurry through the crowd, balancing trenchers of bread, jugs of ale, steaming platters of pottage. Dogs weave underfoot, tails wagging, waiting for scraps. The hall is loud, almost raucous. Laughter, songs, knives clattering against wooden plates. For a brief moment, the howling wind outside is forgotten. Frost may be forming on the windows, but inside there is fire, food, and fellowship. The plain fact is this: the Great Hall was the only space in most castles where heating ever succeeded. A massive hearth dominated the room, fed with logs as thick as tree trunks, hauled in to burn all night. Rank determined your seat, close to the blaze if you held power, shivering on the fringes if you did not. Yet even here, warmth was fickle. A few feet from the fire, the cold crept back in. Above, heat rose uselessly into the rafters, leaving the floor chilled and the people huddled in cloaks. Chroniclers even noted a curious custom. Winter feasts doubled as survival strategies. Nobles timed their largest gatherings for the coldest months, relying on the heat of hundreds of bodies packed together to turn the hall into something resembling cozy. Some accounts even mention servants ordered to stand closer, shoulder to shoulder, simply to generate more warmth. Feasting, then, was never just celebration, it was also survival. But the glow didn't last. When the music faded, the guests stumbled off, and the servants cleared the tables. The fire was left to burn low. Embers glowed faintly, shadows stretched long, and silence reclaimed the hall. Within hours, the chamber itself would be as frigid as any other stone room. Imagine lingering by the hearth, unwilling to leave, stretching your hands toward the fading flame. Your cheeks flush hot, but the cold creeps along your back, reminding you of the freezing chamber waiting above. Smoke stings your eyes, clings to your hair, and still you hesitate, because the thought of leaving feels like surrendering to the night. Historians debate whether some castles developed more sophisticated heating systems in their halls. A few point to vents and flues as evidence of improvement. Others dismiss it as wishful thinking, arguing that medieval builders never prioritized comfort. The consensus leans toward the harsher truth. Only those nearest the fire were truly warm. Everyone else played at pretending. Even the acoustics betrayed the hall's nature. Every laugh echoed, every footstep amplified, reminding you this wasn't a cozy lodge, but a cavern of stone and power. And when silence returned, it felt oppressive, as if you were sitting inside the chest of a slumbering giant. The most telling moment came not in the feasting, but in the transition. Picture leaving the glow of the fire, stepping into a narrow passage lit by a single torch. The draft strikes like a knife. Your breath fogs. The warmth you carried drains from your body as though the castle itself feeds on it. That brutal shift from fleeting comfort to endless chill defined medieval nights. Some nobles lingered until dawn, dozing on high-backed benches drawn close to the fire. Servants collapsed beside the embers rather than face their bedchambers. To sleep there meant sparks, smoke, and noise, but compared to the icy rooms above, it was almost a blessing. Travelers often complained more about that short walk from the Great Hall to their chambers than about the night itself. The shock of moving from warmth into cold stayed with them, their bodies shivering long after. In their words, it was as if the castle punished anyone who dared to imagine comfort. The fading glow of the hall was more than physical. It was psychological. Once you left it, you knew the night would be long and merciless. The Great Hall was not simply a room. It was the fragile illusion of warmth, surrounded on all sides by a fortress of ice. It was ritual, a gathering of warmth before surrendering to the cold. Every torch extinguished, every goblet drained, marked one more step toward the shivering ordeal of bed. Even in the golden flicker of candles, you could sense how temporary comfort really was. The fire that once roared now whispered faintly, sparks snapping, then vanishing. A lone servant poked at the embers with tired resignation before leaving them to fade. The hall, once filled with laughter and clattering plates, now fell silent. The echo of voices replaced by the groan of timbers and the faint sigh of wind sneaking through arrow slits. You pull your cloak tight around your shoulders and turn toward the staircase, reluctant. The glow of the great hall lingers in your mind like a dream you wish you could crawl back into. But dreams fade fast. Already your toes are numb, your fingers sting, and you know the rest of the night will be nothing less than a fight for warmth. That brief glow, that ritual of feasting and firelight was more than social. It was survival. Without the Great Hall, castles would have been unbearable prisons of stone. With it, at least, people had a chance to remember what warmth felt like, if only for a fleeting hour. Now you climb higher into the keep. Each step carries you away from the dying fire. The air shifts sharply, like stepping into a cave. The damp chill rises to meet you, clinging to your bones. The walls tower around you, 12 feet thick in some places, an impressive feat of engineering by any measure. Protection, yes, but here lies the cruel irony. The very walls that shrugged off arrows and siege engines also held the cold hostage inside. If you've ever stepped into a basement in winter, you know the sensation. Stone remembers. It hoards chill the way others hoard gold, radiating it back into the air long after the sun has fallen. Medieval builders mastered permanence and defense, but comfort was never their priority. Their walls were fortresses against men, but never against the weather. Historians agree on one thing. In most castles, warmth never traveled far. A fire blazed, smoke curled upward, but take 10 steps from the hearth, and you were already in an icebox. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries describe noble families gathered as close to the flames as propriety allowed, cloaks drawn over their heads, while behind them servants stamped their feet just to keep blood flowing. The fire created only a fragile bubble of tolerable air, while the stone beyond refused to yield. Travelers' journals add another detail. The walls themselves seemed alive. They sweated. Condensation gathered on the cold stone, streaking downward in thin rivulets. At night you might lie awake, listening to the steady drip of water onto the rushes by your bed, a lullaby more maddening than soothing. In some seasons, moss even grew indoors, clinging to the damp walls. A castle might look like a fortress, but to live in one was sometimes closer to inhabiting a cave. Modern scholars still debate whether rich tapestries and woven hangings truly made much difference. We imagine grand chambers lined with cloth of gold or velvet, thick enough to soften both sight and sound. But did they insulate? Some researchers argue that the fabrics cut drafts and created pockets of warmer air. Others dismiss it as romantic invention, pointing out that no cloth, however fine, could compete with freezing winds sliding through unglazed windows and under ill-fitted doors. The truth remains elusive, but what is clear is that people were desperate enough to try anything. Picture it now, a chamber in late January. The fire in the hearth is small, perhaps already guttering. The walls loom around you like cliffs, their surfaces slick with moisture. Even wrapped in wool, you shiver. The bed stands proudly at the center, its heavy curtains pulled tight. Inside, perhaps the air is a few degrees warmer, a cocoon carved out of frost. But beyond those curtains, the chamber feels like a tomb. The psychological weight was as heavy as the physical cold. Chroniclers wrote of dreading the chill more than hunger, more even than illness. Hunger passed, fevers broke. But the cold, night after night after night, was relentless. When you lived in a castle, you could never escape it. That sense of being imprisoned inside your own walls left a mark that words still carry centuries later. You imagine lying there, coverlet pulled to your chin, listening to the hiss of wind squeezing through arrow slits. Your ears burn from the chill, your fingers stiffen, your breath rises in pale clouds. Even your dreams, when they come, are haunted. Images of fire always chased by images of ice. The walls do not protect, they imprison. The castle is less a home than a vast refrigerator that never switches off. And that's the truth of it. Castles were not glamorous. They were survival machines, yes, but the cost of that survival was comfort. Stone kept you safe from arrows, but it never kept you warm. Every winter's night was a reminder. Living in a fortress meant staging a war not against men, but against the elements. The battlefield was always the same. Your chamber, your bed, your own body. You shuffle across the chamber floor, and instead of polished wood or rugs, your boots crunch against rushes strewn thick upon the stone. At first, they seem humble decoration, but they were practical. Rushes softened the cold underfoot, absorbed spills, and most importantly, acted as crude insulation. Records from the later Middle Ages describe how households renewed them several times a year. Freshly laid, they carried with them a hint of the outdoors, grassy, earthy, almost like summer had been brought inside. For a brief moment, the scent was comforting, a reminder of warmth and life. They padded footsteps, muffled sound, and gave the illusion of softness underfoot. But the charm never lasted. As weeks turned to months, the rushes decayed. Ale spilled, bones and bread crusts lodged in the layers, and vermin moved in, mice scurrying, insects feasting. By the end of winter, they were less a floor covering than a midden. One French moralist wrote with disgust that walking on them felt like wading through filth. And yet, those rushes had their purpose. They trapped heat close to the ground, thin as it was. More importantly, they absorbed moisture from the perpetually damp stone. In a castle where walls wept with condensation, where moss crept silently indoors, that mattered. It was one more weapon in the ceaseless war against cold. Otherwise, every step across the chamber floor would have landed on slick stone, puddled with freezing water. That was the purpose of rushes, to create a barrier, however fragile, between human bodies and the unrelenting chill of the castle itself. A curious aside appears in English household records. Sometimes herbs such as lavender, rosemary, or meadowsweet were scattered among the rushes. It was partly practical. Strong-smelling plants disguised the stench of rotting scraps, spoiled ale, and the creeping mold that inevitably accumulated. But it was also psychological. Imagine lying down in a chamber heavy with smoke and damp, and then catching the faintest trace of lavender drifting upward. It wouldn't warm you, but it might soften the edges of the night, making survival feel a fraction more bearable. There's an ongoing debate among architectural historians about how effective these rushes really were. Some argue they created real insulation, layering into mats that blunted the icy stone beneath. Others dismiss them as mostly symbolic, a ritual of order and cleanliness, rather than a true technology of warmth. After all, most heat loss came from the walls and ceilings, not the floors. The evidence is patchy, contradictory. Were Rush's ingenious medieval adaptation, or merely a messy custom dressed up as tradition? The answer is lost in the mists of damp straw. Picture it now. You lie in bed while a servant scatters new rushes across the chamber. They crunch softly underfoot, releasing faint aromas as they're trampled down. For a fleeting moment, the room feels cleaner, almost civilized, as though the outdoors has been invited inside. But you know the illusion won't last. By morning, the rushes will already be damp, beginning the slow march toward decay. The sensory assault of such a room is staggering. Beneath your blankets, you might feel the scratch of wool or the heavy softness of fur, but around you hangs the must of rotting rushes, the sharp tang of herbs, and the permanent haze of wood smoke clinging to your clothes and hair. The floor rustles with movement, mice darting in search of crumbs, insects whispering unseen. Nothing lets you forget that sleep was not luxury, but survival. And yet, there is ingenuity in it. People transformed plants pulled from fields and riverbanks into tools against the cold. They weren't thinking of carpets, insulation, or comfort. They were thinking of weapons, whatever could push frost back another inch. Even the floor was part of the nightly battle. Stone was the enemy. Rushes were the shield. And every morning began with the question, how long until these two betrayed you with damp and rot? Now picture yourself seated at the edge of the bed, your fingers brushing the mountain of fabric piled there. If there was one medieval secret to surviving the night chill, it was textiles. Wool, linen, fur, layered until a sleeper resembled less a person than a cocoon. Household inventories make this abundantly clear. Linen sheets formed the foundation, smooth, cool against the skin, but offering little insulation. Over these came thick woolen blankets, heavy enough that chroniclers compared them to the weight of a hound sprawled across your chest. And if you were wealthy, you piled furs on top, fox, sable, ermine, or even bear. Nobles invested fortunes into their beds, not only for display, but because winter nights without such defenses could be deadly. There's a wry detail in the sources. Servants joked that once their masters were tucked in, they could barely move. The layers pinned them down so completely that rolling over became a feat of strength. Imagine being swaddled under 6 blankets, so tightly packed that you risked either lying still all night or tugging the covers loose and freezing. Warmth demanded immobility. Comfort was traded for survival. Fur especially deserves its own attention. Beyond luxury, it was practical. Fox pelts, marten skins, sheepskins, all were dense, trapping heat with ruthless efficiency. One chronicler tells of a noblewoman in Burgundy who refused to travel without her ermine-lined covers, even in summer, lest the night air sicken her. To us, it sounds indulgent, even absurd. But in a world where drafts slice through every chamber, paranoia about cold was entirely rational. Strange customs appear in the records too. Some households believed too much linen was dangerous, that linen drew out the body's heat. To counter this, they layered wool above and below, sandwiching the linen between fur and blanket. Did it work? Scientifically, probably not. But it reveals the way folklore and practicality mingled, turning sleep into ritual as much as necessity. Scholars still argue over the meaning of textiles in castles. Were furs simply survival gear, or were they primarily status symbols? On one hand, inventories list staggering numbers of fur coverlets owned by the wealthy. On the other, peasants survived without them, relying on coarse wool alone. The truth, as usual, lies in between. Furs were both vital tools and glittering badges of rank. They kept nobles alive through harsh winters while simultaneously announcing their power. Now imagine yourself beneath these layers. The linen beneath your skin feels cool, almost damp. The wool scratches faintly, prickling your arms. Above it, the fur presses down with smothering weight, heavy yet comforting. The blankets pin you against the straw mattress. You shift slightly, but any larger movement risks breaking the fragile fortress of warmth. Your breath fogs in the air before warming the small space beneath your covers. Every sound is magnified, the rustle of linen, the scratch of wool, the faint musk of animal pelts. There is something primal about it. You are wrapped in the skins and fibers of the natural world, encased in what once lived and breathed. Every thread is a reminder that survival meant turning nature itself into armor. And this is the essence of medieval sleep. Building a fortress inside the fortress, not with towers or battlements, but with cloth and fur. Each night you barricaded yourself against the cold with layers of fabric, constructing a cocoon against the stone. Without them, even the most magnificent castle chamber became a crypt. So as you lie there in this imagined cocoon, you begin to understand the ritual. Gather every blanket, pile them high, weigh yourself down until movement becomes impossible, and then hope. Hope that the layers hold through the night. Hope that morning comes quickly. Because in a medieval castle, sleep was not rest. Sleep was endurance. The bed itself was never just furniture. It was a machine, an invention designed to carve out a livable climate inside a room that otherwise belonged to the cold. When you draw back the curtains of a medieval four-poster, you aren't simply peeking into a private sleeping space. You're stepping into a survival capsule, a micro-world that made nights endurable. Household inventories from noble families reveal how central these great beds were. Unlike the rough pallets of peasants, noble frames stood tall as a man, raised well off the ground, carved from oak or walnut so massive they seemed more like architecture than furniture. 4 stout posts rose like pillars, often ornamented with intricate carving, and they supported a canopy overhead. The canopy was not just decorative, it was functional. Once draped with thick curtains, it trapped heat like a tent pitched indoors. A drafty chamber hovering just above freezing could, within the cocoon of the bed, become tolerable. The difference of only a few degrees might mean the difference between misery and survival. Imagine closing the curtains tight. Suddenly, your own breath, your own body heat, the layers of bedding all combine to create a small, private climate. There's a frequently cited record of a French duchess who insisted her bed travel with her on carts whenever she moved households. It seems extravagant until you realize the stakes. Without her own bed, with its canopy, curtains, and familiar defenses against drafts, she risked shivering through endless nights in strange chambers. For her, a bed wasn't luxury. It was life support. In some English records, the curtains were even waxed or lined with oiled cloth to resist drafts. Imagine tugging them shut, the fabric heavy, faintly smelling of beeswax and resin. The curtains not only kept the cold at bay, but muffled sound, dimmed light, and created the illusion of privacy in spaces that were never truly private. Scholars still debate their effectiveness. Did the beds genuinely retain warmth, or were they more a psychological comfort than a physical one? Archaeological evidence suggests that many were layered and thick, implying real insulation. But some argue the warmth was felt mostly in the mind. the reassurance of being enclosed, hidden, and safe. Whatever the truth, people believed so deeply in their importance that portable canopy beds became a noble necessity. Now, picture yourself sliding into one. The frame creaks beneath your weight, the straw mattress rustles. You reach for the curtain and draw it closed. Instantly, the atmosphere shifts. The drafts are cut off. Your breath no longer fogs as quickly. The chill is still present, but softened. You hear less of the water dripping along the stone, less of the cough of a servant in the passage, less of the dog barking in the courtyard. What you hear instead is the rustle of your bedding when you shift, the faint musk of wool and fur, the steady rhythm of your own breath. The chamber outside may be vast and hostile, but inside this curtained cocoon, you've carved out a pocket of survival. Of course, it was never perfect. Some nights, condensation froze the curtain stiff. Other nights, smoke from the hearth seeped inside and choked you awake. But for most nobles, the four-poster represented the closest thing to safety from the cold. An ingenious adaptation not of grand invention, but of small, practical necessity. No central heating? Then build a climate bubble around yourself. No insulation? Then hang heavy curtains and turn your bed into a fortress. Each night was a negotiation with the cold, and the canopy bed was the truce. Now imagine lying there, eyelids growing heavy, the world beyond the curtain fading. The chamber is still freezing, the castle still drafty, but here inside your bed, survival feels possible. You drift towards sleep, not because the castle has grown warm, but because through fabric, wood, and human ingenuity, you've outwitted the cold just enough. And beneath it all, beneath the curtains and blankets, there was still the foundation of every night's rest, the mattress itself. What lay beneath your body could determine whether you woke sore and frozen or whether you passed the night with some measure of comfort. In the Middle Ages, bedding came in many forms, but two dominated the landscape: the feather bed and the straw tick. The feather bed was luxury incarnate. Imagine lowering yourself into a thick sack stuffed with goose or duck feathers, soft and pliant, cradling your body with warmth. Noble inventories list them with reverence, carefully stored, guarded, and transported whenever the household moved. A well-stuffed feather mattress might sit a foot above the frame, buoyant as a cloud in a room otherwise hard as stone. Families prized them like heirlooms, passing them down through generations. They were not just comfort, they were symbols of rank and power. But even luxury had its flaws. Feather beds could become suffocatingly hot, trapping body heat until sleepers woke drenched in sweat, even in the depths of winter. One 15th century letter preserves a guest's complaint that his host's bed swallowed him whole like a goose in a pot. Too many feathers and you didn't sleep on the mattress. You sank into it, clawing your way upward whenever you shifted. For most people, though, reality meant the straw tick. A large sack stuffed with straw, hay, or reeds beaten flat until it formed a crude mattress. Peasants slept on them. Soldiers slept on them. Lesser castle chambers were filled with them. Cheap, easy to refill, moderately effective, they lifted you off the icy floor and gave you something more forgiving than stone. But straw brought its own curses. It flattened quickly. Stalks poked through the cloth, scratching skin. Fleas nested within. Bed beating became a necessary chore, whacking and shaking the sack to fluff it up and drive the vermin out. By morning, your body might itch, your back might ache, but you had survived the night. There are even records of people mixing herbs into the straw: lavender, mint, pennyroyal, not only to sweeten the smell, but to repel pests. Imagine lying back, the faint fragrance of crushed herbs rising beneath you, almost disguising the sour tang of damp straw. For a moment, you might believe the bed was clean, civilized, even pleasant. For a moment, because in truth, whether you sank into feathers or scratched against straw, sleep in a medieval bed was never simple. It was an art of compromise, a balance between cold and heat, comfort and suffocation, luxury and squalor. And every night you faced the same quiet war, to build a fortress inside your fortress, a fragile cocoon against a world of stone and frost. If you've ever lain on a straw-stuffed mattress, you know the smell never leaves you. It lingers, earthy, musty, creeping into your clothes, clinging to your hair. It is the scent of fields brought indoors, a reminder that even rest was rooted in the raw materials of survival. Researchers still argue about how common feather beds truly were. Some claim they were rare luxuries, found only in the chambers of the highest nobility. Others point to household records showing that even middling families owned at least one feather bed, kept like treasure, brought out for the Lord or honored guests. The disagreement is more than academic. It reveals how much sleeping surfaces mattered. They were valuable enough to be meticulously noted in inventories, passed down in wills, fought over as inheritances. Imagine yourself now, stretched out on a straw tick in a drafty chamber. The sack rustles beneath you, uneven lumps pressing into your back. Each shift releases a puff of grassy scent, mingled with the sharp bite of dried herbs scattered in to keep vermin away. Somewhere nearby, mice skitter across the rushes, their tiny claws whispering in the dark. You wonder if they'll pay you a visit before morning. The blankets above you press heavy, but the straw beneath reminds you that comfort was never guaranteed. Now, picture the alternative. A feather bed in a noble's chamber. You sink into it, body cradled by softness, embraced by down. At first it feels divine, like floating, but before long the warmth grows stifling. The feathers shift under your weight and you roll into a hollow that clutches you too tightly. The curtains trap both heat and air. You push at the covers, searching for a breath of freshness, only to find yourself sealed in. And yet, even this discomfort is 1,000 times preferable to straw. To sleep on feathers was to announce privilege. To sleep on straw was to accept necessity. Both, however, answered the same primal question: how to keep the body alive inside cold stone walls. And so, as you drift deeper into this imagined night, you realize medieval sleepers were never passive. Every mattress, whether humble or magnificent, was a strategy. You didn't simply collapse onto a bed. You chose between materials, layered your defenses, and waged a nightly battle with the cold. But even the most carefully built bed, curtains drawn, blankets piled, feathers puffed, was not always enough. Furniture could only do so much. On the bitterest nights, what determined survival wasn't wood or cloth. It was company. Sleeping alone in a stone chamber meant your heat bled away, stolen by walls that drank warmth like a sponge. But sleeping together meant warmth multiplied. Bodies became radiators, pressed close in the dark. Noble households knew this, though they rarely said it outright. Servants often bedded down in adjoining rooms, sometimes on pallets at the foot of their master's bed. The arrangement was not only about service or security, it was practical. More bodies meant more heat, and every degree mattered. At first, the difference was subtle, but by midnight, when frost gathered on the inside of shutters, when the rushes froze solid, every extra body was salvation. Monastic dormitories understood this well. Monks slept in long rows, straw beds lined side by side in drafty halls. It was framed as communal discipline, but survival was at stake. Soldiers in barracks did the same, lying shoulder to shoulder, cloaks pulled tight, trusting that together they could resist the chill. One curious note comes from a 14th century English manor. A nobleman's will specifically commanded that his favorite squire be allowed to sleep near the chamber fire after his death. Scholars see in this not only affection but recognition. Warmth was inheritance. Companionship a privilege as valuable as land. To be granted a place by the hearth or even a place in the Lord's chamber was an honor measured in degrees of heat. And then there were the animals, dogs especially. The saying, a three-dog night, may belong to later folklore, but the principle is ancient. Hounds were heaters, as practical as blankets. 2 mastiffs curled at your feet might keep your toes from going numb. Travelers even recorded inns where guests slept not just alongside strangers, but with dogs, goats, or sheep pulled into the pile. The smell was overpowering, but warmth always trumped fragrance. How common was bed sharing among nobles? Scholars still argue. Some believe it was routine. Lords with favored companions, ladies with their maids, travelers with fellow guests. Others insist intimacy among the elite was tightly controlled, with servants confined to nearby pallets rather than under the covers themselves. But in humbler households, the answer is clear. Bed sharing was the norm. Families of 6 or more might all sleep together, parents, children, even grandparents, forming a knot of limbs beneath one heap of blankets. Privacy was irrelevant when survival was at stake. Now imagine yourself in such a bed. At first, the closeness is awkward. Elbows jab, knees bump, someone coughs, a blanket slips, and cold air rushes in. But then, slowly, the warmth builds. A shared cocoon forms, body heat trapped and multiplied. You feel the dog's weight against your feet, the slow breathing of your companions beside you. Muscles unclench. The wind may howl outside, the castle may groan and drip, but here, in this cluster of bodies, you almost believe in comfort. Of course, there were drawbacks. Fleas and lice spread faster in crowded beds. Whispers carried secrets that daylight couldn't contain. But measured against the threat of shivering through the night, the trade-off was obvious. You chose warmth over dignity, companionship over solitude. To modern ears, the thought of sharing a bed with siblings, servants, or even animals might sound unthinkable. But to the medieval sleeper, it was common sense. In a world of stone and frost, every extra body was a blessing. So tonight, as you pull your blanket tighter, remember those long ago sleepers. They faced the same darkness, the same cold, with far fewer defenses. Their solution was simple, practical, timeless. Share what warmth you have and pray the night passes mercifully. Even with mattresses and furs, with curtains drawn tight and bodies pressed together, the struggle against the cold didn't end there. The final line of defense was what you wore to bed itself. Imagine blowing out your candle, the chamber plunging into gloom and sliding under the covers. Tonight, your blankets and your bed curtains aren't the only things keeping you alive. So is your clothing. Unlike the modern custom of slipping into pajamas, or nothing at all, medieval sleepers often went to bed nearly as bundled as they were by day. Clothing became insulation. Household accounts and fragments of surviving garments show that the staple bedtime attire was the nightshirt, a long, loose linen garment resembling an oversized tunic. Linen might not sound warm to modern ears, but it was practical, easier to launder than wool, smoother against the skin, breathable enough to wear night after night. Over that base, you might add a woolen tunic, a cloak, or whatever spare fabric you could muster. To a medieval mind, the logic was simple: more layers, more safety. But one detail stands out: the nightcap, or coif. Small cloth caps, sometimes tied under the chin, sometimes pulled snug over the ears. Why the obsession with covering the head? Because people believed, quite sensibly, that most body heat escaped through it. A sleeper without a cap was like a knight without armor, dangerously exposed. Illuminated manuscripts even show figures in bed, neatly wrapped from head to toe, looking more like they're about to travel than about to dream. Of course, not every sleeper looked the same. Poor families repurposed their undertunics. Wealthier nobles commissioned shirts embroidered at the collar, edged in fur, or even trailing ribbons from their hoods. Practicality and display blurred together. One curious medical text from the 15th century even recommended binding the feet and hands in wool or linen before bed. Primitive socks and mittens were meant to keep the extremities alive through the night. You can almost feel it: hands swaddled, toes wrapped, every inch of skin shielded from the bite of stone air. Historians still debate how specialized these garments were. Did peasants have night clothes, or did they simply collapse in their work tunics? Records of wills and inventories, however, mention night linens explicitly, at least for the middle and upper classes. Whatever the rank, though, the principle was clear: cover everything. Modesty reinforced the practice. In a world where bed sharing was common, stripping down was unacceptable. Even married couples were shown in manuscripts wearing shirts and caps, warmth and propriety braided together, making nightclothes both practical armor and social uniform. Now picture yourself following this ritual. You strip off your heavy outer garments, pull on a long linen shirt, tug a wool cap snugly over your ears. The fabric is cool and scratchy at first, but soon your skin warms it. The wool smells faintly of lanolin, earthy but reassuring. Your cap presses gently around your head, muffling sound, enclosing you. You wriggle into position, swaddled like a parcel, every wrinkle smoothed, every knot tied. For you, sleep begins not with undressing, but with dressing for battle. And yet, even with all this preparation, there was still one more ritual before bed, one that belonged to the servants. Picture the moment just before you slip beneath the blankets. A servant enters, carrying a long-handled pan, its brass surface glowing faintly in the firelight. Inside, hot coals crackle and hiss, filling the air with the sharp smell of ash and heated metal. This was the warming pan, a simple but ingenious device because no one wanted to climb into sheets that felt like slabs of ice. The ritual was precise. The servant slid the pan back and forth between the bedclothes, the perforated lid releasing waves of heat. The sheets puffed with smoke, the air tinged with the faint tang of burning wood. For a few blessed minutes, the bed transformed from frozen prison to something almost welcoming. Without this step, you might lie shivering for an hour before your body heat softened the linen. Inventories from noble estates list warming pans right alongside candlesticks and chamber pots, ordinary tools of nightly life, expected as much as a bed frame itself. By the late Middle Ages, wealthy households across Europe considered them essential. A chamber without one was either neglected or occupied by someone too low in rank to merit such luxury. But luxury carried hazards. Letters complain of scorched sheets, blackened linen, even fires sparked when a careless servant left the pan too long in one place. Imagine crawling into bed only to find a smoking hole in your bedding. Or worse, sparks smoldering in a chamber filled with dry rushes. More than one tale survives of noblemen leaping from bed in panic as flames licked at their hangings. The tool of comfort could turn into a tool of ruin. Not all uses were practical either. One curious Italian account describes sprinkling herbs directly onto the coals before sliding the pan between the sheets. Lavender, rosemary, and sage smoldered together, their smoke perfuming the air, believed to purify sickness and chase away ill humors. You can almost smell it now, sweet herbs mingling with hot embers, clinging faintly to the linen as you settle in. A ritual at once practical, superstitious, and deeply human. And so, with body bundled, bed warmed, curtains drawn, and companions close by, the medieval sleeper finally surrendered to the night. Not in ease, but in defiance. Each stitch of cloth, each ember of coal, each herb-scented breath, one more weapon against the cold siege of stone. Every night was a battle, not only against the cold, but also against the unseen enemies of the dark. Illnesses thought to ride on drafts, chills that seemed to creep into the bones and never leave. The warming pan became both tool and symbol, a compromise in metal and ember. Specialists in medieval life still debate how widely it was used. Some argue it was confined to high-ranking households, too costly, too dangerous for ordinary folk. Others counter that humbler versions existed everywhere. Clay pots filled with embers wrapped in cloth, slid under blankets for a burst of fleeting heat. The truth is elusive. Fragile tools rarely survive the centuries. What is clear, though, is that some method of preheating the bed existed across all layers of society. Imagine it in your chamber now. A servant draws the brass pan slowly over the sheets. Steam rises as damp evaporates, the air briefly smelling of smoke and hot metal. When the pan is pulled away, you slip under the covers, trapping the heat like stolen treasure. For a few minutes, it feels miraculous, summer smuggled into the heart of winter, and then it fades. The trick was never to keep you comfortable until dawn. It was simply to soften the first shock, to ease you into slumber. If the body could relax long enough for exhaustion to take over, your own warmth would carry you through. The warming pan was a bargain with the night. Give me a little comfort, and I will endure the rest. You tug the blankets tighter, drifting in the haze of ember-scented linen, when suddenly something shifts at your legs. A weight presses against you, warm, alive. A dog curls into the crook of your knees, sighs, and settles. Perhaps two, perhaps even three. This too was a custom. Dogs in the bed were not indulgence, but necessity. Dogs were more than guardians and hunters. They were heaters. Their coats radiated warmth. Their loyalty kept them near through the long hours of night. A chamber that felt like an ice cave transformed when a hound pressed close. Records even mention small lapdogs gifted to noble women not only for companionship, but specifically for warmth. Larger breeds stretched across the bed's foot, blocking drafts, shielding toes from frostbite. Elsewhere in Europe, travelers described choosing stalls with animals over beds in unheated inns. Horses, cattle, sheep. Their sheer mass turned the air warmer than any chamber could. Imagine lying in a hay-scented stable, breath fogging in the dark, but body warmed by the presence of a cow lying near. Not glamorous, but effective. A French proverb once claimed that a faithful dog keeps the frost from a master's heart. Poetic, but also practical. Their warmth was literal, their presence comforting. Scholars debate how common this was among the elite. Some argue nobles frowned on it, allowing only servants or companions nearby. Others point to letters and wills suggesting it was widespread, especially in rural or frontier castles where etiquette bent to survival. Whatever the truth, dogs left paw prints in the history of sleep. Picture it vividly. You lie swaddled in linen and wool, the curtains pulled close. Outside, wind shrieks along the battlements. Inside, your toes ache until the warmth of a hound presses against them, coarse fur and the faint smell of earth filling your senses. Another dog curls at your side. Soon you are encased not just in cloth, but in living heat. The air is still icy, the chamber still unforgiving, but inside the bed, you are transformed. Of course, this intimacy had drawbacks. Dogs shed hair, dragged dirt, sometimes gnawed bones beneath the covers. Fleas followed them, biting indiscriminately, but fleas were preferable to frostbite. Better a blanket fouled than a body frozen. The sensory mix stays with you. The musky tang of fur, the sharp sting of smoke in your hair, the press of heavy covers, and beneath it all the rhythm of another creature breathing. To share warmth was to share survival. Later generations coined the phrase a three-dog night to mean bitter cold. The image captures the medieval truth. One dog meant the chill was manageable. Two meant serious frost. Three meant the night was deadly, and every available source of warmth was pulled into the bed. Pull back the bed curtains in your mind for a moment. Step outside the noble chamber. Across the courtyard, in the shadow of the servants' quarters, a very different world of sleep takes form. Here the contrast becomes stark. Nobles had grandeur, feather beds, fur coverlets, warming pans, carved canopies, but grandeur did not guarantee warmth. Noble chambers were cavernous, designed to impress, not to insulate. A single fire roared, but the stones swallowed heat like a sponge. Even under heaps of down, a lord might breathe mist into the air. Meanwhile, peasants lived in humbler huts of timber and daub, small enough that a single hearth could warm the entire room. Thatched roofs, thick with straw, acted as insulation. Families huddled together, animals stabled at one end, and the combined heat filled the space far better than the lofty halls of the gentry. One visitor to a 14th century English village remarked with surprise that the poorest cottages held warmth better than the Lord's Tower. Status determined much, but not everything. Nobles could afford fine wool, imported furs, linen softened by repeated washings. Peasants made do with coarse wool patched thin, sheepskins cured in smokehouses, blankets that smelled of lanolin and fire. They lacked elegance, but their houses kept out the cold. Some even slept directly on benches near the hearth, children curled in their laps, risking sparks but guaranteed warmth. In contrast, nobles often climbed icy staircases away from the fire, toward chambers where grandeur gave little comfort. Which truly slept warmer? Scholars still debate. The hierarchy of warmth was not always the hierarchy of status. Did wealth automatically buy better sleep, or did peasants in their cramped but snug cottages endure the winter nights with greater ease? The evidence points both ways. Some scholars argue that the aristocracy's mountain of textiles, fur-lined coverlets, woolen blankets stacked like armor, gave them superiority. Others insist that the lower classes, packed tightly into smaller spaces warmed by a single hearth, often fared better than lords in their cavernous, draft-filled chambers. The truth resists neat conclusions, and the debate itself reminds us how sleep mirrored the divisions of society. Picture the two scenes side by side. In the castle, a nobleman stirs uneasily beneath piles of bedding. His breath curls white in the air. Every gust of wind rattles the shutters, echoing in the chamber's hollow vastness. The fire in the hearth crackles faintly, but most of its warmth dies before reaching the bed. Down in the village, a peasant family squeezes together on a straw mattress before the hearth. Children nestle like kittens in the crook of their mother's arms. The smell of animals drifts from the stall nearby, heavy but comforting. Their space is crowded, earthy, alive with warmth generated by fire, flesh, and fur. One bed is ornate, carved, hung with embroidered curtains. The other is rough, patched, and humble. But which body wakes warmer? The question lingers unanswered. Both worlds devised strategies, both accepted discomfort, and both proved in different ways that survival in the medieval night was never about perfection. It was about endurance, adapting homes, rituals, and expectations until rest was just possible enough. As you drift tonight in your own modern bed, central heating humming gently, you might feel the irony. Status determined the trappings, but not always the quality of medieval sleep. Sometimes the humblest hut held more genuine warmth than the grandest tower. You might imagine that once a bed stood in a noble chamber, massive, carved, heavy with curtains, it never moved. But that assumption would be wrong. In practice, families often shifted their beds seasonally. Bedrooms were not fixed sanctuaries. They were flexible, chosen for their relationship to sunlight, fire, and wind. You chased the sun in winter and fled it in summer. Household accounts make this plain. Many castles maintained both winter chambers and summer chambers, not out of whim, but necessity. In the cold months, families retreated to south-facing rooms where the low winter sun struck through the windows for a few precious hours each day. The walls absorbed a fraction of that weak warmth, making the air less hostile, mornings less brutal. Come summer, they abandoned those sunlit rooms and moved into the north-facing ones, shaded and cool. Edward Ford's household records describe this routine in detail. Servants hauled feather beds, linens, hangings, and even entire canopies from one chamber to another, recreating the Lord's nest wherever the season demanded. It was a logistical ordeal, beds dismantled, furnishings carted down corridors, tapestries rehung. But in stone palaces, immobility meant misery. Flexibility was survival. One courtier at Burgundy complained bitterly in a letter that he lost his chamber to frost. The walls grew so damp and cold that he refused to sleep there, retreating instead to a smaller room facing the sunrise. His phrasing is telling. The castle was not simply shelter, it was an adversary. Rooms were not possessed forever. They were conquered by cold, surrendered, and retaken with the shifting seasons. Archaeologists still debate how universal this practice was. Some argue it was reserved for only the grandest estates with multiple chambers to choose from. Others point to evidence, window placement, fireplace distribution, documentary records, suggesting that even modest castles designed sleeping spaces with seasonal shifts in mind. The debate may never be resolved, but the image is clear. A noble household migrating within its own walls, as if they were birds shifting nests when the weather turned. Now, picture yourself following this ritual. In November, you abandon the lofty solar, too exposed to winter winds, and retreat to a narrow chamber with southern windows. In May, you carry your bed once more into the shaded hall, trading warmth for coolness. Every move is a negotiation with the seasons, proof that in a stone castle, even your bedroom was never truly your own. In autumn, you begin to eye the sunlit side of the keep, already anticipating the long nights to come. Winter is not an abstraction. It is a looming adversary. Every shaft of light, every moment of warmth becomes precious. And so preparations begin. Servants dismantle your bed, hauling frame, mattress, and hangings piece by piece down echoing corridors. The sound of carpenters tightening joints, the thud of hammers driving pegs, and the scrape of posts against the stone floor carry through the keep. Tapestries are hammered into place, heavy cloth meant to hold back the drafts. By the time the first frost arrives, the room greets you with pale morning light and the faint promise of warmth. The sensory detail is vivid. You wake to thin sunlight filtering through shutters, its touch weak but welcome. The woolen curtains, newly hung, smell faintly of sheep and lanolin. The floor crunches as servants sweep fresh rushes across it, their brooms stirring the earthy scent of plants just pulled from the fields. The relocation does not banish the cold. It merely manages it. What was once unbearable becomes survivable. Peasants, too, shifted their sleeping spaces seasonally, though with less ceremony. In winter, entire families abandoned lofts and pressed close to the hearth, bedding down in the smoky warmth of the main room. In summer, they retreated upward to lofts or barns where breezes moved freely. Whether in castles or cottages, sleep was never tied to a fixed bedroom as we imagine today. It was mobile, dictated not by interior design, but by sun, wind, and fire. This truth reframes our modern assumptions. A medieval bedroom was not a permanent sanctuary. It was a temporary camp, reshaped constantly by the seasons. Beds shifted, chambers rotated, walls hung with new cloth, and life adapted. The castle itself seemed alive, its rooms opening and closing like chambers of a heart. Families moved within it like nomads, chasing light, fleeing damp, making and remaking their refuges year after year. It reveals another truth of medieval sleep. It was dynamic, never static. The fight against cold demanded planning, foresight, and constant adjustment. You did not sleep where you wished. You slept where the season permitted. Every year, the cycle repeated, a migration measured not in miles, but in rooms. Now stand by the narrow window of such a chamber. Feel the draft slip across your skin like the brush of an invisible hand. Unlike today's sealed panes, castle windows were little more than apertures, defenses against arrows, but invitations to the wind. No glass, no double glazing. At best, wooden shutters creaked on iron hinges, closing with a groan. Glass was so rare in the early centuries that it was reserved for chapels, oratories, or the most private rooms of lords. For everyone else, there were shutters, heavy planks barred from the inside. In summer, they stood open to admit air and light. In winter, they shut tight, but wood alone was a poor barrier. Cold crept through cracks, damp seeped inside. The practical solution was cloth. Linen soaked in oil or wax, stretched across frames, turned translucent and water-resistant. By day, it emitted a dim amber glow, soft and hazy like sunlight through parchment. By night, it muffled the shriek of wind, but never silenced it. The fabric snapped faintly with each gust. Shutters rattled. Sleepers learned to live with the constant reminder that their fortress was porous. Some households experimented with alternatives. A 13th century French record describes horn windows, thin slices of animal horn scraped translucent and mounted in frames. They blurred the world outside as though seen through fogged glass, but they resisted weather better than cloth. Imagine standing in such a room, looking out through panes that glowed yellow in the light, the landscape beyond distorted and warped. Crude, imperfect, yet still a barrier. Inside, the air was only a fraction less brutal, but that fraction mattered. Archaeologists and historians still argue about how common such innovations were. Some believe oiled cloth and horn windows were luxuries for only the wealthiest households. Others suggest that by the late Middle Ages they were surprisingly widespread, at least in Northern Europe. The evidence is fragmentary, but the very debate itself testifies to human desperation. People were willing to try anything that might blunt the night air. Now picture yourself leaning toward one of these windows. The shutter is barred, the cloth tacked tightly across the frame, and still a sharp line of frost creeps along the sill. Your breath clouds in the moonlight. The snow outside glows pale, reflecting the sky. Inside, the wind moans and rattles, slipping through unseen cracks. The soundscape is haunting. Shutters bang in a distant passage. Cloth snaps faintly like sails. Servants mutter as they shove rags into gaps, their breath steaming as they work. Some households even pressed moss or clay into seams, desperate insulation in messy handfuls. It stained the walls, smelled of earth, and flaked away with time. But in the face of freezing nights, beauty mattered less than survival. Peasants fought the same battle. Their cottages often had no windows at all, just slits covered with shutters or membranes. Animal bladders stretched thin made crude panes, letting in distorted light, rooms glowing faintly as though seen through a veil. At night, frost hardened these coverings into brittle sheets, turning translucence into ice. In such huts, light was strange, but warmth was at least contained. For nobles, the irony was cruel. Their towers gave them defense and status, but exposed them to the full bite of winter winds. Guests often remarked that the higher they slept, the colder they felt. A peasant in his low hut might envy a lord's featherbed and furs, but not the draft whistling through a tower chamber. And yet, there was beauty even here. Imagine lying in bed on a moonlit night. The shutters cracked just enough to admit a silver shaft across the flagstones. The cold seeps in, yes, but so does poetry. Shadows of branches ripple across your curtains. The snow outside glows faintly blue. The chamber is still hostile, but it whispers of wonder too. Medieval sleep balanced between discomfort and fragile peace. The windows were less barriers than reminders, that no matter how thick the walls, the night always found its way in. Sleep was never about conquering the cold entirely. It was about learning to live with it. Draft after draft, sigh after sigh, until the first gray light of morning. You picture yourself approaching the hearth of a castle bedchamber, certain that salvation waits in the blaze. Surely, you think, a fire in a stone room must mean warmth. Surely this is the remedy for the icy breath of the night. But the truth is far less comforting. Medieval fireplaces were enormous, yawning structures built into the walls, their chimneys so wide that whole tree trunks could be shoved inside. Flames roared, sparks hissed, embers collapsed into glowing heaps. The sight was magnificent, almost theatrical. Yet for all their spectacle, these fires failed at their basic task. They bled more heat than they held. The reason was simple physics. The broader the chimney, the faster the heat escaped upward with the smoke. The wider the opening, the stronger the draft that sucked warmth out of the room and into the night. The result was a cruel paradox. The more fuel you fed, the brighter the blaze, but the less of that energy remained to comfort you. Step close and your cheeks prickled with heat. Step back only a few paces and your breath misted in the air again. The fire created a bright oasis of heat, but only in a narrow radius. Beyond that circle, the chamber remained bitterly cold. Records make clear how costly this arrangement was. A single large castle might consume wagon loads of timber every week in winter. Forest management became as urgent as fortification. One French lord complained bitterly in his letters that keeping his great hall warm emptied the woods faster than any war. Guests joked too. Some quipped that the fireplaces were large enough to roast an ox, but too feeble to warm a man. The humor stings with truth. These hearths provided light, spectacle, and majesty, but little real relief against stone walls that drank up heat like a sponge. Households tried to compensate. Iron firebacks were sometimes set behind the flames, reflecting heat into the room. Hearths were lined with tiles to store warmth, glowing faintly long after the logs collapsed. Heavy furniture was placed near the fire to catch and hold what warmth it could. But these were partial solutions, small defenses against an enemy too vast to conquer. A roaring fire might keep your feet warm if you sat on the hearth itself, but your back remained cold. And your bed, tucked against the far wall, might as well have been outside. Scholars continue to argue over just how effective these fireplaces were. Some contend that, combined with wall hangings, carpets, and heavy furnishings, they created a layered system of warmth that mattered. Others insist they were more symbolic than practical, rituals of flame and fuel that reassured more than they relieved. The truth, as so often, lies in the gray middle. Some castles managed better than others. Climate, resources, and design all shaped the outcome. Now imagine yourself in such a room. The fire crackles loudly, spitting sparks onto the stone hearth. Smoke curls upward, leaving a tang sharp in your nose. Your face flushes with prickling heat, yet your shoulders stay cold. You shuffle closer, hands stretch until your sleeves nearly singe. For a moment, comfort. But when you turn and walk back to your bed, the temperature drops with each step. By the time you slip beneath the blankets, the illusion of warmth is gone. Peasants, by contrast, often benefited from their smaller scale. A single central hearth in a modest cottage warmed the entire interior, smoky though it was. Cramped walls held heat better than lofty chambers. Bodies and flames together created tolerable warmth. In grand halls, fires devoured forests yet left rooms half frozen. Once again, grandeur failed to translate into comfort. And yet, the ritual of the fire still mattered. It was never only about warmth. It was about light, about gathering, about defiance. People prayed by the fire, told stories, dozed in chairs, clutched hands in marriage contracts. Even when heat faded, the glow reassured. It reminded them that darkness had not yet won. So when you picture a medieval night, do not imagine a roaring hearth saving you from frost. Imagine instead a fragile island of heat in a sea of cold, comfort that lasted only while you stayed near. Comfort that vanished the moment you climbed into bed. The hearth was performance as much as tool, and people learned to be grateful for what little it gave. But another reality intruded: smoke. These fires were not clean, efficient machines. They belched fumes, left soot, coated walls in grime, and filled chambers with haze that stung eyes and lungs alike. To stay warm was to breathe smoke, to cough through prayers, to wake with a throat raw from ash. Contemporary chroniclers complained often. One monk in northern England noted that his cell grew so blackened with soot that he coughed more than he prayed. Noble women wrote bitterly of gowns ruined, linens discolored, tapestries dulled from hanging a single season near the fire. Court records mention the cost of replacing hangings turned gray almost overnight. Architecture made matters worse. Chimneys were crude shafts, lacking dampers or flue controls. Smoke did not always rise politely. It drifted, eddied, poured back into rooms. A gust of wind from the wrong direction could choke a hall in minutes. Imagine trying to sleep while smoke burned your throat, your eyes watering beneath the covers. Some households tried to disguise the filth. Walls were smeared with lime or clay, brightened temporarily, hiding streaks of soot. The black marks always returned, but illusion mattered. Clean walls at least felt like renewal. The smell, however, never left. A mixture of charred wood, damp stone, burned wool. It clung to blankets, clothes, hair. It followed you to bed, into your dreams. Historians remain divided on just how tolerable these smoky rooms were. Some argue that medieval people simply adapted, their senses dulled to it, their lungs hardened by years of exposure. Others insist the complaints in letters and chronicles prove that smoke was never truly accepted, that it was endured but always cursed, always dreaded. Either way, the hearth was a paradox, a beacon of safety and yet a constant source of discomfort, a performance of warmth that left shadows of soot behind, a reminder that even the most powerful castles, with all their defenses, could not protect their sleepers from the simplest of enemies, the air they breathed. Others insist that even medieval people recognized the health toll, pointing to repeated complaints in medical treatises about choked air and blackened lungs. Perhaps both are true. People endured because they had no choice. But endurance did not erase discontent. They grumbled endlessly about sore throats, ruined clothing, coughing fits that racked the chest in the still hours of night. Now imagine yourself lying in bed after such a smoky evening. Your hair reeks of ash. The wool of your blanket is steeped in the acrid tang of soot. You draw the curtains of your four-poster bed, hoping to create a sanctuary, but even here, the smoke lingers. The air tastes bitter. When you cough, the rasp burns your tongue. Your cocoon is no escape. It carries the ghost of the fire inside it, and peasants fared no better. In fact, their plight was often worse. Many cottages lacked chimneys altogether. Smoke from the central hearth rose directly into the rafters, darkening them until they gleamed black with tar. It then seeped slowly through the thatch, drifting into the night. Families lived perpetually in a gray haze, eyes watering, lungs tightening, babies soothed to sleep by smoke-laden air. Yet this, too, was normalized. People grew up under beams coated in centuries of soot. Some even believed it beneficial. The smoke preserves the roof, they claimed, driving out insects, drying the wood. Survival and superstition blended together in every breath. Children wheezed, old men coughed, but the house endured. The sensory reality was overwhelming. Your skin prickled as fine particles settled on it. Every blink brought tears. The rushes on the floor turned dark with grit, crunching underfoot. Servants swept endlessly, their brooms stirring clouds that settled again hours later. The cycle never ended. Each winter, smoke and cold locked in a duel, and every household knew you could not ease one without worsening the other. Still, fire was non-negotiable. Without it, no one survived. So people made their peace. They scrubbed soot from their faces each morning. They accepted ruined tapestries. They endured headaches and hoarse voices. Warmth demanded sacrifice, and the sacrifice was clean air. Tonight, as you breathe easily in your modern room, air filtered, fresh, unnoticed, you can marvel at the luxury. For medieval sleepers, every warm night meant another smoky morning. Their dreams were steeped in the scent of burning wood, their waking hours shadowed by soot. And when the hearth dimmed, when the embers glowed low and shadows swallowed the chamber, there was often only one glow left, a candle. You might think of a candle as decoration, as ambience. For many medieval sleepers, it was both a fragile light and a faint source of heat. A single wick could not warm a room, of course, but in a world where every flicker counted, even the smallest flame mattered. Candles came in many forms. The wealthy burned beeswax. These gave a clean, steady flame, bright enough to read by, fragrant with a faint, honeyed sweetness. They were expensive, precious enough that their use was often confined to chapels, ceremonies, or the Lord's private chamber. To burn beeswax nightly was a display of wealth as much as a practical act. For everyone else, there was tallow, candles made from rendered animal fat. These sputtered, smoked, and filled the air with a greasy stench. Imagine lying in bed, half suffocated by the odor of charred fat mingling with damp stone, wool blankets, and lingering ash from the hearth. Yet even these were valued. They gave both light and just enough heat to take the edge off the dark. People improvised with them too. Place a candle close enough to your bed curtains, and the fabric warmed faintly beneath your hand. Group several together on a stand, and their collective glow softened the shadows and warmed the small air pocket around you. Hardly central heating, but enough to ease the dread of cold sheets. There are curious anecdotes in the records. A 14th century letter describes a noblewoman who demanded 12 candles lit in her chamber every winter night. Only then, she claimed, could she rest. Servants complained of waste, but her request reveals a truth. In the medieval world, light itself became a substitute heater, a psychological balm as much as a physical one. But the hazards were obvious. Candles were small, fickle fires, and bed curtains of wool and linen were dangerously flammable. Records abound of accidents, chambers reduced to cinders by toppled flames. One grim tale from Germany tells of a squire who fell asleep with a candle perched on the bed rail. He woke choking in smoke, his blankets already aflame, and barely escaped alive. His recklessness was condemned, but the real culprit was necessity. He had wanted warmth too close at hand. Scholars still debate whether medieval people understood the danger fully. Some argue they did, noting inventories of charred fabrics and laws regulating fire use. Others suggest that constant reliance bred complacency. Fires were too integral to fear. Whatever the case, the balance between danger and comfort was constant. Now place yourself in that chamber. The hearth has dwindled to a bed of glowing embers. Shadows ripple across the walls. A single candle burns on a wooden stand by your bed. Its light is golden, warm, fragile. The faint heat reaches your face as you tug the blankets up. Wax drips steadily, the wick pops softly, the flame sways in the draft. Outside the curtains, the room is vast and dark. Inside, the candle creates a circle of safety no larger than your arms. You listen, the tiny hiss of the wick, the faint crack of cooling wood, the sigh of wind at the shutters. Your world shrinks to this pocket of warmth, this flicker of life. And you realize that the candle is not just illumination, it is companionship, a fragile ally against the enormity of the night. In cottages and inns, simpler versions of this scene played out. Travelers used rushlights, cheap reeds dipped in fat. These burned unevenly, hissing and spitting, their glow flickering like restless spirits. But for a peasant lying on straw or a soldier in a drafty inn, even this faint glow meant reassurance. It said, "You are not alone in the dark." Parents lit small lamps near their children, not only to chase away the cold, but also to banish fear. Even monks who prided themselves on austerity allowed lamps to burn in dormitories, citing safety and necessity. The sensory mixture was unforgettable. The greasy scent of tallow fat, the acrid smoke of sputtering wicks, the faint honey of beeswax in wealthier spaces. The walls grew streaked with soot, dark veins running upward where flames had licked the air for months. Bedclothes stained with wax, the fabric stiff where droplets had fallen and hardened. Yet these imperfections were accepted. They were the price of survival. In the harshest winter, the candle was more than decoration. It was hope, a fragile promise that the night might be endured. So as you drift tonight beneath your clean electric light, think of that precarious medieval flame. It warmed just enough to trick the body into rest, and it risked disaster with every spark. Sleep was never free from tension, even in the smallest details. To close your eyes was to trust that the flame would last until morning, without turning comfort into catastrophe. Step away now from the noble chambers and into communal quarters. Here unfolds another world of medieval sleep, the collective dormitory. Not everyone had curtains, feather beds, or servants. Monks, soldiers, apprentices, and household staff often slept together in vast rooms where survival depended on proximity. Take the monastery. Rules prescribed simplicity, which meant long stone halls lined with cots or pallets. The floor stretched endlessly, broken only by narrow slits of windows set high in the wall. Each monk had his own place, a plank or a thin straw mattress, sometimes little more than a sack stuffed with reeds. Beds stood side by side, so close that one man could hear the steady breathing of the next. Privacy was unknown. Warmth, however, came from numbers. Surviving accounts describe the soundscape vividly. Coughing, snoring, whispered prayers, the rustle of woolen blankets. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with the mingled smells of straw, wool, and human breath. Yet the collective body heat turned the hall into a space warmer than any solitary chamber. One chronicler noted with astonishment that the cloister felt warmer than the Lord's tower, for the brothers lay as sheaves in a field. Military life brought a harsher version. Soldiers billeted in castles or camped in the field, crowded into barracks and barns. Long rows of men stretched across straw pallets, weapons stacked within reach. Cloaks doubled as blankets, and comrades slept shoulder to shoulder. The smell was pungent, sweat, leather, smoke, and damp straw all blending together. Yet for the exhausted, even this stew of odors was bearable. To sleep shoulder to shoulder was to survive. A curious detail appears in the regulations of certain nightly orders. Candles were kept burning all night in the communal halls, not to warm, but to comfort. The glow offered psychological reassurance, a small reminder that light had not abandoned them, even when the temperature hardly shifted. The flame mattered as much for the spirit as for the flesh. Historians still debate whether communal sleeping was chosen deliberately for warmth or simply arose from necessity. Some argue monasteries mandated it as a form of discipline, stripping away luxury. Others suggest the warmth of shared space was a practical advantage that conveniently aligned with spiritual ideals. The same ambiguity surrounds soldiers. Was it camaraderie that drew them together, or cold that made solitude impossible? Likely, it was both. Now picture yourself lying in one of these halls. The straw beneath you crackles as you shift. To your left, a neighbor coughs. To your right, another rolls over, the sound echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Rats scurry across the rushes, ignored by men too tired to care. The smell of smoke and sweat hangs heavy, yet the air is less biting than it would be alone. Your blanket scratches your chin and you tuck it tighter, grateful for the heat of the bodies around you, even as you long for silence. Apprentices and servants lived in much the same way. Castles were filled with small side chambers, lofts, and even stairwell niches where boys or maids unrolled straw pallets. They layered cloaks, curled together, and turned storage rooms into makeshift bedrooms. Unlike their lords, they had no warming pans or feather beds. But they enjoyed something nobles lacked: proximity. Their spaces were smaller, more crowded, and paradoxically warmer. The sensory experience of these communal spaces was unforgettable. Rough wool against skin, the musky odor of dozens of bodies pressed close, the low hum of breathing rising and falling in rhythm like waves against stone, the scratch of straw under shifting limbs, the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. This was not peace in the modern sense. It was endurance. People did not expect silence or solitude. They expected to last until dawn. So tonight, as you rest in your solitary bed, think of those long halls of monks whispering prayers before extinguishing the lamps. Think of soldiers collapsing in rows after battle, boots still on, weapons near. Think of servants huddled in hidden corners, sharing cloaks and crumbs. Their warmth came not from silk or fur, but from each other. Medieval sleep was as much about community as it was about comfort. You've settled into this crowded dormitory in your imagination. But even here, warmth was never guaranteed. Fires needed tending, and someone always had to rise in the small hours to stoke the embers. Sleep was never uninterrupted. Men woke not only from coughs and snores, but from necessity, the practical demand to keep flame alive. And here another difference emerges: the medieval body clock itself. People did not expect to sleep in one long stretch. Modern notions of 8 unbroken hours did not apply. Instead, life followed a pattern some scholars call segmented sleep. The first sleep came soon after dusk, lasting until roughly midnight. Then, like clockwork, people woke, not from alarm bells or duty, but from habit, from centuries of rhythm shaped by firelight and darkness. You sit before the hearth as a servant pours mulled wine into a cup. The liquid steams faintly, releasing ribbons of fragrance that cut through the heavy odors of smoke, damp wool, and lingering soot. Cinnamon and cloves swirl with the sweetness of honey, and for a moment the chamber feels transformed. You lift the cup to your lips. The rim is warm, the first sip sharp, almost startling, before the heat blooms in your chest. You exhale slowly, and it feels as though the very air has softened. Your eyes grow heavy, limbs loosen. The day's stiffness melts into a slow drowsiness, and when you finally climb into bed, the blankets no longer feel oppressive, but almost inviting. At the foot of the bed, a stone wrapped carefully in cloth radiates its faint, steady heat against your toes. It is not a blaze, not a bath, not a fire, only a small stone, but it feels like a gift from another season, a reminder that summer has not entirely vanished. For once, you do not dread the long stretch of night ahead. The sensory impressions press themselves upon you. The sweet tang of spiced wine lingering on your tongue, the hiss of a log collapsing into embers, the earthy musk of wool brushed with smoke, the prickling warmth of the heated stone. Your body surrenders, convinced, if only for a few hours, that comfort is possible. But here lies the truth. Such indulgences were fragile, precarious. Heat faded quickly. Drinks cooled into sticky dregs. Stones shed their warmth, leaving only the memory of heat. By midnight, the chamber had reverted to its usual state, cold, breath steaming in the air, drafts prying at every seam of cloth. These rituals never offered permanent salvation. What they gave instead was psychological grace, fleeting moments of ease that made the endless chill tolerable. So as you rest tonight, picture how deeply medieval people yearned for warmth. They engineered clever tools, improvised with what materials they had, and transformed even the simplest comforts, a sip of ale, a stone from the hearth, a sprig of herb, into weapons of survival. Their nights were not effortless. They were acts of endurance, stitched together from ingenuity and ritual. And every bath, every glowing coal, every swallow of mulled drink was, in its way, a small rebellion against the cold. Yet even this was not enough. For medieval minds, the night carried more dangers than frostbite. Cold was not merely physical, it was spiritual, even supernatural. The darkness itself was suspect. People believed the night air could carry illness, that unseen forces lurked in the drafts and shadows, waiting to sap life from the vulnerable sleeper. So, as much as people turned to blankets, fire, and stone, they also turned to charms, rituals, and superstitions. Sleep required not only warmth, but protection. One of the most common practices was hanging amulets above the bed. These varied widely depending on wealth, region, and faith. In some homes, it was a simple wooden cross, hastily carved but trusted to shield. In others, it might be a relic, an object believed to hold the power of saints. For peasants, humble pouches filled with herbs were strung above the sleeping space, releasing their sharp aromas into the night. Rue, mugwort, and juniper were favorites. They were thought to repel not just insects, but spirits and sickness, driving away the invisible poisons of the dark. Imagine yourself lying in bed beneath a canopy strung with such fragrant bundles. The air is thick, smoke from the hearth, musk from the wool, and now the sharp herbal tang that mingles with it all. It is a strange perfume, halfway between medicine and mystery. You inhale it deeply, telling yourself that as long as the scent holds, so too does your safety. Prayers became another shield. Monastic rules instructed brothers to recite psalms before lying down, believing the rhythm of Scripture protected both body and soul through the vulnerable hours of slumber. Noble families likewise gathered at the bedside to murmur paternosters or Ave Marias, sometimes aloud, sometimes under their breath. But even peasants with little Latin and less learning whispered charms of their own, half prayer, half spell. They crossed themselves against frost, against fever, against the sudden death that seemed to hover in the night. Parents leaned over their children, pressing kisses on small foreheads, while murmuring words meant to ward off the night hag, the shadowy figure blamed for pressing on chests, stealing breath, and leaving sleepers gasping awake. Whether you believed in demons, witches, or simply the chill of bad air, the ritual was the same: words to bar the threshold between the body and the dark. One curious detail survives from a 15th century German household manual. It advises sleepers to place iron objects, knives, keys, scissors, beneath the bed or pillow. Iron, people believed, repelled spirits. It anchored the sleeper to safety, weighed the soul against wandering, and cut through the unseen webs of malice spun by night creatures. You picture yourself now slipping a knife under your straw mattress. It is not for bandits, it is for the unknown. Scholars still debate how widespread such practices were. Some argue that amulets and charms were near universal, woven into the nightly routine of peasants and nobles alike. Others caution that much of the surviving evidence comes from moralizing texts that condemned superstition, not from ordinary records. But whether official or whispered, the belief that sleep required protection is undeniable. Picture the sensory world of such a chamber. A candle guttering, its flame haloing the iron scissors laid beside the pillow. The faint clink of metal when you shift, the smell of herbs mingling with tallow smoke, a whispered prayer that fades into silence. The cold may be the most obvious enemy, but here, in the imagination of the medieval sleeper, the night itself has teeth. Iron was thought to repel more than just thieves. In the imagination of the medieval sleeper, it repelled demons and fairies too, those elusive beings believed to slip into rooms during the long hours of darkness. The cold was visible, tangible, something you felt in your toes and bones. But spirits were another kind of danger, unseen and unpredictable, and iron was their natural enemy. A small knife, scissors, or key tucked under the pillow became a silent guard, glinting faintly in the firelight before being swallowed by the shadows. No one spoke to it, yet everyone trusted it. You picture yourself in such a chamber, the vast space heavy with drafts and silence. Beneath your pillow rests a narrow blade, the hilt pressing faintly against the straw mattress. It is not for battle, not for cutting bread, but for keeping away the things that whisper through cracks and slits. The thought steadies you. It is easier to close your eyes knowing something solid waits beside you. And then came rituals tied directly to warmth, rituals that seemed to modern ears almost playful, but to their practitioners were serious weapons against the cold. One folk belief insisted that turning your shoes upside down beside the bed would keep frost from biting your toes. Another held that if you whispered the names of 3 saints before blowing out the candle, your body heat would not flee during the night. Such gestures may strike you as quaint superstitions, but for the medieval mind, they were strategies as practical as an extra blanket. In a world where science had not yet separated itself from faith, where experience blurred with belief, every small action mattered. Why not flip your shoes? Why not whisper the names of saints? Each act carved a tiny margin of safety in an otherwise merciless night. Scholars remain divided on how seriously these customs were taken. Some argue they were heartfelt, deeply woven into the rhythm of daily life, performed with genuine trust that the saints or spirits would intervene. Others suggest they were more like inherited habits, repeated out of tradition rather than conviction. A child saw a parent turn shoes upside down and did the same. A servant heard her mistress whisper saintly names and imitated it. Belief, perhaps, was secondary to the comfort of routine. Either way, the rituals reveal something essential. Sleep was never trusted. It was not, as we imagine, a retreat into safety and stillness. It was a vulnerable state where cold could gnaw, illness could strike, and spirits could press invisibly upon the chest. People needed defenses. Fire and wool were not enough. They wanted words, symbols, objects to shield the soul as much as the body. Picture yourself now lying in a medieval bed. The curtains are drawn. The fire has burned low, leaving the chamber mottled with shadows that stretch and sway like restless ghosts. Above you hangs a sprig of juniper, sharp scent cutting through the smoky air. Beneath your pillow lies a small iron knife, hidden but comforting. You whisper a prayer, soft and rhythmic, the syllables lapping like waves against the silence. Then you cross yourself, tug the blankets tighter, and let your breath steady. The sensory details make the moment real. The rustle of herbs brushing against the canopy, the faint metallic tang of iron near your head, the warmth of wool pressed against your skin, the echo of whispered words still clinging in the air. For an instant, the night feels less menacing, as though the rituals themselves have carved a circle of safety around your fragile body. Peasants practiced the same, though with humbler materials. Instead of relics, they hung crude charms, small wooden figures, knotted cords, or bundles of dried herbs gathered from nearby fields. Parents tucked garlic beneath children's pillows, believing it warded off sickness as well as spirits. Garlic's pungency filled the air, mixing with smoke and damp straw, turning the small room into a fortress of scent. Even animals were included in these nightly protections. Cows and sheep in their byres were sometimes sprinkled with holy water or blessed before nightfall, their presence thought to strengthen the household against frost and misfortune alike. A stable full of warm, living bodies gave not only heat, but reassurance. To medieval minds, the health of their beasts was bound to their own. A cow that survived the night meant the family might too. In every class of society, the cold night was not only endured with cloth and fire, but with ritual. The noble bedchamber and the peasant's hut shared the same logic. Defend the body, defend the spirit. Faith, superstition, and survival were intertwined. You could not untangle one from the other because each served the same purpose, to make sleep, that most vulnerable of states, bearable. So imagine yourself finally drifting, layers of wool pressing down, iron hidden at your side, herbs swaying faintly above, prayers still echoing in your ears. The cold has not vanished, the drafts still moan at the shutters, but you have done what you can. You have layered body, bed, and spirit alike in protection, and that is enough to surrender to the mystery of sleep. So when you tuck yourself into bed tonight, imagine those little gestures, the flipped shoes by the hearth, the sprig of rosemary brushing against the canopy, the whispered name of a saint breathed into the dark. They were small comforts, yes, but no less real for being intangible. For the medieval sleeper, survival was never purely physical. It was also spiritual armor, woven from faith, habit, and hope. Now step back from the bed itself and take in the chamber as a whole. Beyond blankets, dogs, or charms, the architecture of a room shaped how well its occupants could endure the night. Castles, of course, were built first for defense. Walls thick enough to withstand siege engines, towers high enough to watch an enemy's approach. Comfort came second, if it came at all. Yet over the centuries, builders experimented with ways to make the interiors a little more livable. The result was a patchwork of features, some clever, some mostly symbolic, that aimed to carve warmth out of stone. One such feature was the solar, a private room often reserved for the lord and his family. Unlike the cavernous Great Hall, the solar was smaller, more intimate, and often perched higher in the building where sunlight could filter through. Its size was strategy, not indulgence. A reduced space meant a fire's heat had a fighting chance of lingering. A hearth in a hall might warm only those sitting directly before it, but in a solar, flames could push back against the cold with more effect. Picture such a space: tapestries draped from wall to wall, a carved oak chest against one side, a narrow window facing south to capture the day's thin warmth. The air here feels different from the echoing stone chamber below. Still cold, yes, but not merciless. The fire crackles in the corner, its glow bouncing off patterned cloth instead of bare masonry. A noble family might sit here in the evening, sewing, writing letters, playing games, all beneath a canopy of woven saints, hunts, or mythical beasts. Tapestries were not just decoration. They were insulation disguised as art. Woven thickly from wool or silk for the wealthy, a single hanging might stretch 10 or 20 feet across and weigh so much that servants struggled to hoist it into place. Behind it, the damp stone walls were hidden, and the air directly nearby grew a little less icy. Stand close, and you could smell the lanolin of the wool, earthy and faintly comforting, as though the sheep themselves still lingered in the threads. Archaeological surveys confirm that many chambers were later fitted with wooden paneling for similar reasons. Oak boards, carved and smoothed, created a buffer zone between occupant and wall. They trapped thin pockets of air, slowed drafts, and gave the impression of warmth. Servants often stuffed moss, tow, or scraps of cloth into the gaps to block cracks where the wind slipped through. The result was imperfect, but it showed the determination to transform fortresses into homes. A curious detail emerges in estate accounts. Nobles frequently transported their most prized tapestries from castle to castle. Packed onto wagons alongside silverware and linens, they traveled like portable walls. They weren't simply art, they were survival gear. To a lord, traveling without his hangings was like a knight riding into battle without armor. The walls of an unfamiliar keep could not be trusted, but drape them with wool and suddenly the room belonged to you. Warmer, safer, familiar. And yet specialists in medieval domestic life still argue over just how effective these features really were. Some believe they genuinely made rooms habitable, reducing drafts, holding back damp, and raising the temperature by several degrees. Others insist the benefit was largely psychological. Walk into a chamber stripped bare, its stone blackened by soot, and you felt the chill immediately. Step into the same room hung with cloth glowing in the firelight, and your mind insisted it was warmer, even if the thermometer, had such a thing existed, would barely register a change. The truth, perhaps, lies in both. A tapestry might not transform a chamber into a cozy modern living room, but it dulled the edge of the cold, softened the echo of the walls, and filled the eye with color. And sometimes that was enough. Medieval life was full of compromises. Never true comfort, only tolerable survival dressed in ritual and cloth. Now imagine yourself entering such a solar. You draw the curtain back and step inside. The difference strikes you immediately. The air is still chilled, but not biting. The fire in the hearth glows against carved paneling instead of raw stone, the smoke curling upward into a narrow chimney rather than spreading across the rafters. You run your hand along the wall, feeling the rough wool of a tapestry beneath your fingers. The fibers prickle faintly, smelling of lanolin and dye, earthy yet rich. In the half-light, the woven figure of a stag leaps across a meadow, its body frozen mid-stride, yet alive with warmth. You sit down on a carved bench draped with cushions. Beneath you, a rush mat softens the stone, while above you, beams creak faintly in the wind. The chamber is not comfortable. Not truly, but compared to the echoing vastness of the great hall, it feels human in scale, manageable. Here you could almost believe in rest. This was the genius of the medieval solar. It was not luxury in our sense of plush couches or radiant heat. It was strategy made domestic. Shrink the space, line the walls, block the drafts, and concentrate the warmth. A family that retreated here at night was not indulging. They were surviving. That debate underscores the subtle interplay between perception and survival. A room might not be much warmer in reality, yet its tapestries, paneling, and reduced size could trick the body and the mind into believing it was habitable. And that belief alone carried weight, because sometimes perception was the difference between enduring the night or despairing in it. Now picture yourself stepping into such a chamber. The heavy oak door swings shut behind you, muting the howl of wind that roared in the corridor. The stone of the castle still presses all around, but here the effect is softened, reshaped by human effort. The walls are veiled in crimson and gold hangings, their woven figures half lit by trembling candlelight. Hunters pursue stags across one panel. Saints raise their hands in blessing across another. Their still forms flicker with every sway of the flame, At the hearth, fire crackles in a carved surround of gray stone, smoke twisting upward into a chimney that draws reluctantly, sometimes spilling back a curl of haze into the room. The air is warmer here, yes, but only just. Raise your hand to your mouth and you still see the fog of your breath. The difference is one of hostility. In the echoing great hall below, the cold felt predatory, biting through cloak and skin. In this chamber, it feels contained, a shadow kept just beyond the drapery. The sensory impression is layered. You reach out and brush the rough weave of a tapestry, thick wool, scratchy against your fingertips, carrying the faint animal tang of lanolin even after years of dyeing and handling. The smell of smoke weaves itself into everything, clinging to cloth, hair, and hands. You listen to the soundscape, the snap of oak logs splitting in the hearth, the soft hiss of resin pockets burning away, the faint shuffle of servants outside. Each detail combines into something approaching refuge. Not comfort, but respite. Peasants mimic the same strategies, though on humbler scales, where nobles draped woven hunts and saints in bright colors. Villagers hung patched wool or rough cloth dyed with whatever pigments they could afford. Ochres, faded greens, sometimes even cheerful stripes. A painted cloth pinned against the wall served two purposes. It lessened drafts and it brightened interiors otherwise gray with smoke and shadow. In cottages, walls were often daub and wattle, plaster mixed with straw, which itself provided some insulation. Layer a blanket or stitched fabric against it, and you had a crude tapestry of your own. These gestures mattered. Even if the practical effect was slight, the psychological relief was profound. To face bare stone or mud plaster each night was to face the world's indifference. To face a surface softened with color, cloth, or carved wood was to feel for a moment that the household had tamed its space, had drawn a line between outside and inside. Another architectural trick was vertical placement. Builders knew heat rose, and so sleeping chambers were often placed on upper floors. The great hall below, though leaky and drafty, generated immense heat from its hearths and bodies. Some of that warmth drifted upward, seeping into chambers above. It was imperfect. Drafts still sliced through windows and ceilings, but it was something. Children were sometimes given lofts above kitchens, where ovens kept the air warmer through the night. To sleep above bread ovens or near brewing rooms was not glamorous, but it was practical. Rising heat meant fewer shivers, and fewer shivers meant deeper rest. This arrangement was less about privacy than about exploiting every stray degree of warmth. In truth, privacy as we understand it barely existed. Comfort was communal. Survival meant proximity to fires, to family, to animals, even to the smell of bread baking below. The architectural logic of medieval life was always the same: follow the heat. And yet, despite these layers of adaptation, solars, tapestries, paneling, upper chambers, the cold never vanished. It lingered in every corner, seeped through every crack, settled into stone like a memory that refused to fade. The best anyone could do was mitigate, not eliminate, its grip. Still, these architectural gestures mattered because they proved a kind of defiance. Against the fortress of stone, against the winds of winter, people carved out human space. So as you rest tonight, imagine those rooms glowing with the soft shimmer of tapestries, faint warmth radiating from hearths, the dull sheen of wooden boards catching firelight. They were not cozy by our standards. No one in the Middle Ages fell asleep imagining they were snug, but they were gestures of resistance. Each panel, each cloth, each strategic placement of chamber was a human voice raised against the winter silence. They said wordlessly, "This space is ours. This space, at least, will keep us alive." Close your eyes now and imagine the smell of a medieval bedroom. It was nothing like the lavender-scented idyls of modern adverts or the crisp cotton of hotel linen. Instead, it was a dense stew of odor, layered day after day, season after season. To understand how medieval people slept, you must understand what they smelled, because every breath reminded them of the world they endured. The smell of sleep. The first scent was always smoke. Fires burned almost constantly in winter, but medieval fireplaces were far from efficient. Their chimneys were little more than yawning stone mouths, and without clever flues or narrow shafts to draw properly, smoke drifted back into the chamber as often as it escaped upward. The walls darkened, soot streaked stone and timber alike, and the air grew heavy with suspended ash. You could scrub the tapestries or beat the rushes, but the ghost of smoke never left. It embedded itself in every fiber of the room: blankets, cloaks, curtains, even the hair of those who slept there. Imagine lying down after a long day. Your hair carries the acrid tang of the hearth. Your linen shirt smells faintly singed. Even freshly laundered sheets lose their purity within days, adopting the same bitter perfume. To fall asleep in a medieval bed was to nestle into smoke as much as into wool. It clung to your clothes, your lungs, even your skin. Next came the scent of damp wool. Blankets, cloaks, and clothing were rarely truly dry in the deep months of winter. Moisture crept through stone walls, condensed on ceilings and floors, and soaked into anything left lying about. Wool, marvelous for warmth, also absorbed this dampness and held it stubbornly. Its smell was earthy, animal, lanolin-rich, and faintly sour. When you pulled the covers up to your chin, you inhaled a fabric that promised warmth but never freshness. To the medieval nose, that smell became synonymous with survival. Add to this the odor of straw and rushes. Floors were strewn with them. Beds were stuffed with them, and in time both soured. At first, rushes crackled pleasantly underfoot, releasing a grassy aroma, almost like bringing a fragment of summer indoors. Straw mattresses, newly filled, carried the scent of fields, dry and faintly sweet. But weeks of trampling boots, spilled ale, scattered crumbs, and the stealth of mice turned them musty. Rushes began to smell not of meadows but of cellars. Straw flattened and grew rank, releasing little puffs of stale, earthy odor with every shift of a body. One curious note in a 14th century household manual recommended sprinkling dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, meadow flowers, over the rushes to sweeten the chamber. For a few days, perhaps, the fragrance worked. You might walk into a room and catch a surprising whiff of summer fields or crushed lavender. But soon those herbs wilted, ground to dust underfoot, their perfume fading into the sour stew of damp straw and human use. Then there was the human smell. Hygiene was limited. Baths were rare. Sweat was constant. People often slept in the same layers of clothing they wore during the day, garments that absorbed odor hour by hour. The scent was thick, leather rubbed with sweat and rain, wool pungent with lanolin, unwashed skin, and the sour tang of exertion. Beds were shared by families, companions, servants, or animals, compounding the effect. To breathe the air of a medieval chamber was to breathe the air of other people, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating, but always unavoidable. Scholars debate just how overwhelming these odors were. Some argue medieval people were so accustomed to them they barely noticed. The nose adapts, after all, and what seems unbearable to us might have felt normal to them. Others point to inventories, medical treatises, and complaints in letters as evidence that contemporaries were keenly aware of foul air and sought remedies wherever they could. They valued perfumes, incense, and herbs not as luxuries, but as necessary defenses against stench. That debate itself is telling. Smell was not secondary, it was central to the experience of medieval life, and especially to sleep. Now, place yourself in such a room. The fire has burned low, leaving only the bitter tang of smoke curling along the rafters. The damp wool blanket scratches your chin, its sour scent rising each time you shift. Beneath you, the straw mattress breathes out musty warmth, each movement releasing a puff of decay. The rushes on the floor rustle faintly as mice scurry through crumbs. A companion beside you exhales heavily, breath laden with ale and sweat. And somewhere above it all floats a faint, ghostly trace of rosemary, sprinkled days ago, now barely masking the stew of odor. The sensory reality is overwhelming. Smell doesn't fade into the background, it presses into your nostrils, your lungs, your very skin, embedding itself into memory. You cough softly, pull the coverlet tighter, and try to breathe shallowly until sleep arrives. This was normal. This was life. And peasants, though they lived differently, were not exempt. Their cottages smelled of much the same elements, but with an additional layer: animals. Livestock often shared the same structure as the family, stabled at one end of the hut. The warmth of cows or sheep was welcome, but their smell was inescapable: manure, hay, and the musky presence of living beasts. Children fell asleep listening to the slow breathing of oxen and woke to the reek of the stall. For them, the scent of survival was as much animal as human. In both castle and cottage, smell told you what kind of night awaited. Smoke, wool, straw, sweat, animals, herbs, all blended into a signature atmosphere. To our modern sensibilities, it might seem suffocating. To them, it was simply the air of existence, the invisible landscape in which sleep unfolded. Cows, sheep, and chickens each left their mark on the air. In peasant cottages, their presence was not a choice but a necessity. Animals shared walls and sometimes floors with their human keepers. Their breath, their dung, the musk of their bodies all rose and mingled with hearth smoke until the atmosphere grew pungent, sharp, unforgettable. For a visitor from the city, unaccustomed to such intensity, it could feel suffocating. Chroniclers describe travelers gagging at the mixture, retreating outdoors for relief, but for villagers, these odors became part of survival. The smell of livestock was the smell of wealth, of milk and meat and wool, of life continuing through winter's famine. To breathe it was to know that tomorrow's breakfast, tomorrow's clothing, tomorrow's fieldwork had survived the night. Even here, herbs intervened. Bunches of mint or chamomile hung from rafters, their green notes cutting through the heaviness. These sprigs were not mere decoration. They served as insect repellents, fumigants, and small psychological comforts. A faint whiff of chamomile could remind a family of summer meadows even in the depths of January. Mint released sharpness when crushed underfoot, masking the scent of damp straw. Every herb doubled its role: fragrance and protection, beauty and barrier. For nobles, perfume and incense attempted to elevate the atmosphere. Incense burned in braziers added sweetness to the air, though it rarely escaped the mingling of smoke and damp. Perfumed oils dabbed onto linen or woven into sachets created pockets of respite. Step close to a noblewoman's bed, and perhaps the headboard smelled faintly of rose, musk, or ambergris. Yet even here, the grandest chamber could not escape the fundamental odor of medieval life. The stone, the smoke, the wool, they seeped deeper than any perfume could mask. So when you picture sleeping in a castle, do not imagine crisp linen and a rush of fresh air. Imagine instead a medley: smoke that lingered, damp wool that soured, straw that rotted, sweat that clung, herbs that wilted, animals that stank. Every night, every breath was a reminder of the world in which they lived. Scent was not incidental, it was structure. It wrapped around sleepers as surely as blankets did, and perhaps in time, familiarity transformed nuisance into comfort. The smell of home was not lavender or linen, it was wool and smoke. For the medieval sleeper, to breathe such air was to breathe belonging. Scent became identity, woven into every dream and memory. But after the smoke, damp wool, and musty straw, another force stepped in to help medieval people endure the night: food and drink. You might not think of supper as part of sleep, but to them it was inseparable. What entered the stomach shaped the body's ability to withstand the cold. A heavy meal or warm drink became as vital as fur or fire. In winter, households leaned on hearty pottages. Thick stews simmered endlessly in cauldrons hung over the hearth. Barley, peas, onions, leeks, and root vegetables formed the base. Into this, peasants tossed scraps of salted meat or bones, while nobles enriched their bowls with beef, pork, cream, or imported spices. These stews clung to the ribs, filling the body with substance that lingered into the long night. Imagine swallowing spoonfuls of hot broth, steam clouding your face, the warmth spreading down into your belly and radiating outward. For a moment, you forgot the cold chamber waiting upstairs. A curious note from a 15th century English manuscript advised eating leeks before bed because they warm the belly and chase away the chill of death. Whether true or not, the claim reveals how strongly food was tied to ideas of warmth, health, and survival. Every bite carried symbolism. A bowl of cabbage and barley was not just nourishment, it was insulation from the inside out. Drinks played an equally important role. Ale was the universal choice, consumed daily by rich and poor. In winter, it was often served warm, filling bellies with calories and softening the bite of frost. To peasants, a warm mug of ale after supper was a comfort as dependable as the hearth. For nobles, more elaborate drinks offered both warmth and status. Spiced wine or hepocras became a favorite. Heated gently and seasoned with cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, or cloves, spices imported across oceans and continents, it was luxury in a cup. Imagine sitting in a smoky chamber, the golden liquid glowing in a carved wooden goblet. The aroma of cinnamon and clove rose above the tang of soot, transforming the air for a fleeting moment into something exotic. You sip, sweetness burning your throat, and warmth blooms in your chest. There is even a record from the court of Charles VI of France where the king's physician recommended hot meat at night to prevent chill from entering the bones. The logic belonged to humoral theory, the belief that warm, moist substances balance the body's inner fluids, counteracting the cold and dry qualities of winter air. It sounds quaint to us, but the effect was real. Warm drink made cold chambers more bearable. Scholars still debate how much alcohol truly contributed to warmth versus simply dulling perception. Some argue ale and wine deceived the senses, making sleepers believe they were warmer than they were. Others suggest that calories, sugar, and spices offered genuine fuel, raising the body's resilience against chill. Both views hold truth. In practice, medieval people didn't care whether it was chemistry or illusion. What mattered was the feeling, the slow spread of warmth, the heavy lids, the sense that for once the cold could be tamed. Now picture yourself in such a scene. You sit at a long trestle table in the great hall. a wooden bowl steaming before you. You scoop thick pottage to your lips, chew bread crust dipped in broth, and feel the heaviness settle in your stomach. Beside you, a servant pours ale into a rough cup, the foam rising. You drink, warmth and drowsiness building together. Later, in a noble chamber, you cradle a cup of spiced wine. The scent of cinnamon mingles with smoke and damp wool, and your body sighs in relief. When you finally lie down, the blankets feel less hostile, the cold less sharp. This is what food and drink offered medieval sleepers, not luxury, not abundance, but psychological grace. Meals and mugs softened the edges of the night. They bought moments of ease before the inevitable chill reclaimed its dominion. Each hot mouthful was a rebellion against stone and frost. Each sip of ale a promise that you might endure until dawn. Supper's warmth, garlic's bite, and the fragile ones. Others pointed to the real caloric benefit of these drinks, the way ale, mulled wine, or spiced mead gave the body genuine energy through long, cold nights. The truth may rest somewhere in between, a mingling of chemistry and psychology, its real warmth and comforting illusion. It didn't matter which mattered more. What mattered was that both allowed the sleeper to believe they might survive till dawn. Now imagine yourself preparing for bed. A servant presses a wooden cup into your hand. Steam curls upward from the surface, carrying waves of cinnamon and clove, of nutmeg and honey into your nose. You drink. The liquid glows as it slips down your throat, warmth spreading outward, loosening muscles tight from the day, weighing down your eyelids until each blink feels heavier than the last. When you finally climb between blankets, they feel less like icy armor and more like a true refuge, as though warmth already resides inside you, ready to defend you through the hours ahead. For peasants, the ritual was simpler, but no less important. A thick bowl of hot porridge, oats or barley, sometimes sweetened with a scrap of honey, more often salted with onions or herbs, lined the stomach. Families huddled around the fire to eat, bowls warm in their hands, faces flushed red from the glow. Children licked spoons, scraping every last clump from rough wooden bowls before diving beneath shared blankets. Their stomachs felt heavy, and the memory of warmth from food helped them ignore the cold sneaking in through cracks and shutters. A curious folk belief advised eating garlic before bed to prevent frostbite. Whether the explanation was circulation, superstition, or simply the pungent fire garlic ignited on the palate, the custom endured. Farmers in cold regions chewed cloves before lying down, their chambers thick with its acrid scent, layered with smoke and wool until garlic became as much a part of winter as ash and snow. Imagine it. The cauldron bubbling, wine hissing gently as it warmed, herbs crumbling into steam, porridge thickening until it clung to the spoon. Every sound and smell stitched itself into the sensory world of medieval bedtime. Every swallow was another small layer of defense, an inner blanket, invisible but as necessary as wool or fur. Food was not just fuel, it was medicine, ritual, and protection. Without it, the night seemed longer, the blankets thinner, the drafts sharper. With it, the body endured. Supper was the first battlement in the defense of sleep. And yet, not everyone inside those stone walls endured the night equally. The most vulnerable were the youngest and the oldest, whose bodies produced less heat and resisted cold less well. For them, winter was a sharper adversary, and every night a negotiation with danger. Household records from noble families show that children were rarely tucked into grand chambers of their own. Instead, they slept close to warmth, in nurseries adjacent to kitchens, in side rooms near hearths, or tucked in with servants where bodies pressed together gave comfort. Young pages and squires, boys destined for training, bunked in crowded dormitories. Their laughter and whispers flickered like candlelight in the hours before sleep, muffled beneath wool blankets. The logic was simple. More bodies meant more heat. Babies were swaddled layer upon layer, linen closest to the skin, then wool, then furs, if the family could afford them. Cradles often stood near the fire, or, in poorer households, directly inside the bed with the mother, her body heat serving as shield in freezing air. One poignant chronicle from the 14th century describes a noble child laid in a wicker crib by the fire, swaddled in furs and shaded by a little canopy, an image of tenderness, but also of anxiety. For parents knew how thin the margin was between survival and tragedy. Even with such measures, many children never woke. Illness and cold claimed them with merciless frequency. Every parent went to bed with hope balanced against fear. The elderly faced similar perils. Frail bodies lost heat quickly, and stiff joints made shuffling across cold floors more dangerous. In peasant cottages, grandparents were given the place of honor, nearest the fire, where warmth lingered longest, while younger adults accepted colder spots on the edge. In castles, older relatives might be moved into smaller chambers, easier to heat, or even into kitchens and bakehouses where ovens exhaled their stored warmth. One curious letter from Burgundy describes an elderly matron who insisted on sleeping in the bakehouse itself. She swore the residual oven heat gave her a second youth, letting her joints loosen and her sleep come without shivering. Whether her boast was exaggeration or not, it reveals a truth. The old clung fiercely to whatever warmth they could find, even if dignity had to be sacrificed for survival. Medical texts of the era advised special measures for the young and the aged. Physicians recommended heated stones wrapped in cloth to be tucked at their feet, or mulled drinks to fortify the humors. They warned that sudden chills could extinguish life like a candle snuffed by wind. Their language was vivid, their concern constant. Everyone knew these groups lived on the knife's edge of winter. Historians today still debate how far medieval families went to protect children and elders. Some argue that records showed deep compassion, extra measures taken, sacrifices made, even in poor households, to guard the fragile. Others counter that mortality rates remained stubbornly high, suggesting that while love and care existed, the limits of resources and knowledge made tragedies unavoidable. Both arguments hold truth. Care and inevitability coexisted in every chamber, shaping medieval attitudes toward both childhood and old age. Now imagine yourself inside a peasant cottage on a winter's night. The fire has sunk to embers, but the hearth still radiates. A baby lies swaddled so tightly his face is no more than a pink oval peeking from cloth. A grandmother snores softly nearby, her cheeks painted red by the glow of dying coals. Parents rise to drape cloaks over both, ensuring they remain in the warmest spots. Children crowd onto a straw mattress, whispering and giggling until exhaustion overtakes them. The chamber smells of porridge, smoke, wool, and garlic. But the warmth of family togetherness lingers longest of all. In a castle, the image shifts. A nursemaid rocks a cradle near the fire, humming softly while a child whimpers against the chill. Upstairs, an elderly noblewoman demands her bed curtains be drawn tightly, while a servant crouches at her feet, sliding hot stones wrapped in cloth beneath the covers. She clutches her rosary, muttering prayers against the cold's creeping fingers. Both worlds, peasant and noble, reveal the same truth. The youngest and the oldest required the most care, and even then, sometimes care was not enough. The sensory details of these nights are vivid. The weight of porridge in the stomach, the acrid tang of garlic on the breath, the crackle of straw mattresses as children shift, the rasp of an old woman's cough, the warm glow on a baby's cheeks fading as the embers dim. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never equal. It was always stratified by age, by resilience, by luck. And yet, whether in cottages or castles, families gathered around the most vulnerable, layering them with cloth, prayer, and love, small rebellions against winter's cruelty, children, elders, and the medicine of warmth. The crackle of logs as they're added to the fire, the soft rustle of swaddling cloth, the wheeze of an old man adjusting under blankets. You feel the fragility in the air as though the cold itself waits for a moment of weakness to strike. When you picture medieval sleep, you must remember it was never equal for all. Children and elders carried the heaviest risks, their survival dependent not on their own strength, but on the warmth and vigilance of others. Every blanket tucked tighter, every ember stirred back to life. Every whispered prayer counted. In those long nights, endurance was not merely individual, it was communal. And in that struggle, people came to see cold not only as an inconvenience, but as a profound threat to health itself. To a medieval mind, chill was dangerous. It wasn't just discomfort, it was corruption. A force that warped the body's inner order and opened the door to illness. Medicine in this age revolved around the ancient and persistent theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each fluid, physicians believed, governed temperament and health, and the body's well-being depended on their delicate balance. Heat and cold were thought to sway this equilibrium. Too much warmth could inflame the blood, driving fever and frenzy. Too much cold, and the humors congealed, thickening sluggishly until sickness bloomed. Cold, then, was not merely a temperature. It was a diagnosis. Medical treatises from the 13th and 14th centuries brim with remedies for counteracting night chills. One manual advised rubbing the feet with warm oil before bed. The oil, perfumed with rosemary or sage, was believed to open pores and expel the harmful chill. Another text recommended heated milk with honey, a drink that soothed the stomach, warmed the belly, and, so physicians claimed, kept the humors from turning slow and sullen. To these doctors, warmth itself was medicine. It could be administered like a drug, through food, through drink, through wool garments, through the presence of others in bed. A French surgeon once warned that damp chambers bred melancholy because the chill thickened the black bile and led to sadness of spirit. His prescription? Hang tapestries on your walls, not as decoration, but as protection for the mind. Imagine being told by your physician that failing to decorate properly could make you depressed. It reveals just how inseparably climate and medicine were bound together. Alongside this, formal advice flourished the vibrant world of folk cures, shared by peasants and nobles alike. Garlic and onions, for instance, were not only eaten, they were rubbed on the soles of the feet before sleep to keep chill from entering the body through its lowest point. Others tied charms of wool soaked in wine around their wrists, believing the infusion of warmth and vitality would seep directly into their blood. And there were stranger prescriptions still. One English herbal recommended keeping a live rooster in the bedroom to draw frost away from the sleeper. Did anyone truly endure a squawking bird beside them all night? It's hard to say. Perhaps the idea lingered more as a proverb than a practice. Yet the belief shows how desperate people were for allies against the cold, so desperate that even a rooster might be enlisted in the nightly fight. Modern scholars still debate whether any of these medical measures truly worked. Some argue that oils, hot drinks, and herbal remedies offered real physiological benefit, improving circulation, relaxing muscles, soothing throats, and lending caloric warmth from within. Others insist most of it was symbolic, comfort born of ritual and placebo. The disagreement remains unresolved. But what is certain is this: medieval people believed with all their hearts. To them, the rituals mattered as much as the blankets, because they turned fear into action. Now picture yourself preparing for bed under such medical advice. The fire in the hearth burns low, but its glow still licks the stone walls. A servant kneels at your feet, massaging them with warm oil. The smell of rosemary fills the chamber, sharp and clean, cutting through the heavier odors of smoke and damp wool. You sip a small cup of heated wine sweetened with honey, feeling it coat your throat and spread a slow heat down your chest. Beside the bed, a sprig of garlic rests, pungent and strange, meant to drive away frost as much as spirits. The sensory impression is unforgettable. The slick warmth of oil rubbed into skin, the golden tang of honey clinging to your tongue, the acrid edge of garlic pricking the air. Every detail convinces you that you have armored yourself for the night, not just against discomfort, but against imbalance itself. Sleep is no longer passive, it is therapy. And peasants too had their remedies. They lacked physicians and polished manuals, but not imagination. They rubbed goose fat into chilblained skin, believing the grease sealed warmth in. They stuffed mattresses with dried herbs, trusting in both fragrance and hidden virtue. They brewed simple teas of chamomile or mint, drinking them warm before bed to settle the belly and soften the edge of cold. Mothers whispered charms as they tucked children in, sometimes kissing their feet to seal the warmth inside. Fathers muttered half spells, half prayers while banking the fire, trusting that words themselves carried weight against frost. These small acts carried as much meaning as any physician's advice, for they spoke of care, of vigilance, of refusing to surrender to the cold. Imagine a cottage where children drift to sleep with the smell of garlic hanging in the rafters, where a grandmother massages onion juice into her aching joints, where a father places a warmed stone at the foot of the shared bed before lying down himself. Did these rituals work? Perhaps only a little, but the point was not perfection. The point was survival. Every remedy, every charm, every pungent clove of garlic was one more thread in the fragile tapestry that kept bodies alive until spring. Frost indoors, when the cold breached the bedchamber, women brewed herbal teas of nettle or chamomile for children, believing the warmth prevented coughs. Men wrapped their legs in wool soaked with vinegar to keep circulation alive through the night. In cottages and castles alike, these practices blurred the line between superstition and medicine. They gave people agency, some small sense that they were doing something against a force that seemed unstoppable. The irony, of course, is that many ailments were born of the very defenses used to hold winter at bay. Fires filled lungs with smoke and soot. Heavy blankets, stiff with damp, left joints aching in the morning. Oily ointments collected grime and dust, irritating skin. Yet to medieval minds, these were acceptable sacrifices. Better to cough through a smoky night than to freeze silently in a clean one. The calculus was always survival, never comfort. So when you picture medieval sleep, Remember, it wasn't just about enduring discomfort. It was wrapped in theories of health, remedies both strange and familiar, and a constant anxiety that the cold might tip the fragile balance of life itself. Every blanket laid, every herb burned, every ember stirred carried medical weight. Each night was not just slumber, it was treatment. To fall asleep was to trust that these preparations would hold you until morning. And yet, there were nights when none of it was enough. Step with me now into a castle chamber at the height of January. You imagine stone walls holding firm against winter, but instead you find frost blooming inside. The cold refuses to stay politely outdoors. It seeps through, decorating the walls with cruel artistry. In the dim candlelight, delicate crystals creep across the bed curtains, glittering faintly. The basin at your bedside, set out with water for washing, has frozen solid, a glassy block within its bronze rim. Imagine lying there, blankets pulled high, and seeing ice lace itself across the carved posts of your bed. Imagine your own breath condensing, freezing into a silver sheen along the canopy, so that by morning, your sleeping place sparkles like it's been sown with stars. To us, it sounds poetic, but for the noblewoman who wrote of such a scene in a 14th century letter, it was a misery she wanted remembered. A canopy turned to frost was not romance. It was proof that even the richest bedchamber could become an ice cave overnight. The archaeology supports her story. In castles where walls still stand, preservation reveals streaks of white salt where moisture once condensed, froze, then melted, staining the stone. Moisture was not a rare intruder. It was a constant tenant, rising as steam from fires and bodies, then falling back as frost when the temperature dropped. Without insulation, every wall was a battleground of air and stone. Warm breath met freezing rock, and ice won. Servants faced the daily task of scraping frost from walls and windowsills each morning. They carried rags stiff with ice from one chamber to another, their breath fogging as they worked. And still, each night, the frost returned. In some places, it grew dramatic. A curious anecdote from Scandinavia tells of icicles forming inside the rafters of certain great halls. They grew long and sharp, hanging like teeth above the sleeping men. Come morning, they dripped steadily onto beds and rushes, so that servants had to hang cloths like awnings to catch the meltwater. Imagine the unease of lying beneath such rafters, drifting off while hearing the faint crack of ice above your head, wondering whether a shard might fall in the night. Each pop of timber carried the thread of water dripping cold upon your face. Scholars still argue over how common this phenomenon was. Some insist that indoor frost plagued only northern Europe, where winters stretched longest and harshest. Others point to scattered accounts from France, Germany, even England, suggesting that poorly heated chambers everywhere could reach freezing temperatures. Perhaps the truth lies between more intense in the north, but by no means absent further south. Either way, frost within your bedroom was never unthinkable. It was expected. Now, put yourself into that dawn. The gray light filters weakly through horn-paned windows or oiled cloth shutters. You exhale and your own breath drifts like smoke. The bed curtains around you are stiff, edged with crystals that glint faintly. You reach for your basin only to find not water but ice, hard and unyielding beneath your fingers. Your joints ache, your skin protests as you push back the stiff blankets, and the simple act of rising feels like punishment. The sensory world is sharp and cruel, the sting of frozen fabric when your skin brushes against it, the brittle creak of wood beams shrunk tight by frost, the silence, eerie and brittle, broken only by the faint drip of meltwater from rafters. Each sound reminds you that you're not resting in a sanctuary, but in a room besieged by winter. And peasants knew this reality too. In cottages, frost coated the inside of thatched roofs, snow dusting rafters as though clouds had drifted indoors. Children woke with hair rimed in frost, laughing at first until the chill reached their skin and left them sobbing. Parents joked grimly about sleeping with the clouds inside, turning hardship into humor. But humor did not mask the truth. Frostbite, chilblains, and lung infections lurked behind each icy dawn. Even nobles with their feather beds and fur-lined quilts could not escape it entirely. Hot stones warmed the body, yes, and thick curtains trapped what heat they could. But the air beyond those folds remained hostile. You might survive the night, even feel temporarily cocooned. But the moment you pushed the curtain aside, the castle's breath, cold, sharp, merciless, struck you. The fight against cold was not only about comfort, it was about survival, yes, but also about dignity. To rise in the morning with hair frosted, to scrape ice from your wash basin before you could cleanse your face, these were reminders that even lords and ladies were humbled by the elements. Stone walls offered defense against men, but against winter they offered little at all. So, as you lie in your own warm bed tonight, picture that medieval chamber rimed with frost. Picture peasants brushing ice from their rafters. Picture nobles pulling curtains around beds that glittered with their own frozen breath. Sleep was not victory, it was endurance. And frost indoors was winter's cruel reminder that the night always had the upper hand. Expanded section, inns, animals, and the warmth of strangers. At first glance, the idea of sleeping in a stable seems degrading, almost humiliating. A lord reduced to lying beside beasts, a pilgrim tucked against a cow. But for many travelers, the choice was not degrading at all. It was practical. Horses and cattle radiated enormous warmth, their bodies steady furnaces that transformed a frigid night into something survivable. A stable crowded with animals could feel far cozier than an unheated guest chamber high in a stone tower. Chroniclers note that pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago sometimes preferred the stalls deliberately, curling up against hay bales while the livestock shifted and snorted nearby. They described how the animals' breath mingled with their own, filling the space with mist, heavy but warming. The odor was intense, dung, hay, sweat, but so too was the comfort. In the calculus of survival, smell mattered less than heat. A pilgrim wrote with gratitude of the horse's side that lent me sleep, a line that sounds crude today but was a literal truth of medieval travel. In rural regions, hospitality followed even older traditions. Villagers were expected, sometimes obligated, to open their doors to travelers, especially those carrying signs of pilgrimage, shells, badges, or simple letters of passage. A peasant family might offer a spot by the hearth, a corner on a straw pallet, or simply space on the floor. Warmth here came not from wealth, but from generosity and closeness. Imagine arriving at such a cottage. The door creaks open, light spills into the dark, and you're ushered inside. The hearth smolders low, stew lingers in the rafters, and the family shifts to make room. You lie shoulder to shoulder with strangers, farmers, beggars, pilgrims, listening to the crackle of wood, the sigh of sleeping children, the shuffle of animals in the next stall. Privacy disappears, but warmth blossoms. A curious record from a 14th century French town describes communal inns where long wooden platforms were laid out side by side, covered in straw. Dozens of travelers, Men, women, children collapsed shoulder to shoulder, sometimes 2 or 3 deep. By modern standards, the image seems chaotic, even shocking. Strangers pressed together in a jumble of limbs and snores. Yet at the time, this was ordinary. Shared warmth outweighed awkwardness. To be pressed against a stranger was not an indignity. It was an assurance that frost would not claim you. Scholars debate whether such inns offered more comfort than castles. Some argue yes, though crowded, noisy, and crawling with vermin, their small size and communal heat retained warmth better than the vast, echoing noble chambers. Others emphasize the dangers: lice, fleas, theft. An inn was never entirely safe. A purse might vanish, a blanket might crawl with bedbugs, a neighbor might cough contagion into the air. Castles, for all their drafty discomfort, at least offered the protection of locked doors and known company. Both perspectives are valid. The weary medieval traveler often had to choose between cold isolation and crowded discomfort. Neither was truly comfortable, but one carried warmth while the other carried safety. Now, place yourself in one of these inns. You push open the heavy door and step inside, greeted at once by the roar of voices and fire. The air strikes you like a wall: smoke, ale, roasted meat, unwashed bodies. The floor is dirt, trampled into mud by boots. Dogs bark at your entrance, mugs clatter on tables, and a fiddler saws at a tune by the hearth. The innkeeper gestures you toward a space on the platform. The straw crackles under you as you lie down, the sharp ends poking through thin linen. Strangers press against you on both sides. One smells of garlic and sweat, the other of horses and leather. You shift uneasily, tucking your cloak tight, trying not to disturb them. Hours later, the hall quiets. Laughter fades, replaced by snores. The embers in the hearth glow faintly red, casting long shadows on the beams. Your world shrinks to the heat of bodies pressed close, to the steady rise and fall of communal breathing. It is not comfort as you know it, but it is enough. The sensory details press in: the scratch of straw against your skin, the smell, sweat, ale, smoke, thick and unavoidable, the rhythm of a dozen sleepers, punctuated by the whine of dogs nosing through the rushes. You cough, shift, tuck your chin deeper into your cloak. Gradually, despite the noise and smell, your muscles unclench. Warmth trumps dignity, as it always does in winter. Even nobles face this reality when traveling. Royal progressions required armies of attendants: clerks, servants, guards, courtiers. Inns overflowed quickly. A count might find himself lying in a side chamber, separated by a curtain, but still hearing the snores of stable boys outside. Kings often traveled with their own bedding: feather mattresses, tapestries, and bed curtains carried by wagon. But even these luxuries could not conjure warmth from thin air. There is a revealing account from a Burgundian courtier who complained bitterly of sharing fleas with peasants while on the road, despite being lodged in the best inn the town could offer. His words remind us that travel blurred the boundaries of status. No matter how noble your birth, a night on straw beside strangers reduced you to the same human needs: warmth, shelter, survival. For peasants, the inn might offer novelty, a rare night of stories, songs, and company. For nobles, it was often humiliation. But for all, it was a shared human experience. Pressing close, enduring odors, breathing through smoke, and waking with straw clinging to your clothes. So when you imagine medieval sleep, don't picture only solitary chambers or grand beds with velvet curtains. Picture too the crowded inns, the pilgrims curled against horses, the villagers who made room by the hearth. Sleep was communal, messy, noisy, but it was life. And in the end, The lesson was simple. Warmth mattered more than pride. Frost travel and the legends of cold records describe monarchs themselves lodging in monasteries, their entourages spilling into cloisters, barns, and refectories. Entire households absorbed by the hospitality of monks. Even the crowned heads of Europe could not always command comfort on the road. The stone rooms of abbeys were scarcely warmer than castles, their fires just as smoky, their straw just as lumpy. Yet the more enduring record is not architectural, but psychological. Time and again, medieval voices hint at the dread, the real dread, that came with morning. People spoke of fearing the moment they had to leave bed, of lying awake in the dark, knowing that beyond their blankets lay a chamber so bitter that even breathing seemed punishment. They called the cocoon of quilts a prison of necessity. Warm, yes, but one you dared not escape until the sun returned. One English poet, unable to resist metaphor, compared love itself to such a bed. For him, intimacy was not flowers or music, but simply the miracle of warmth, a bed without frost inside the hangings. Love meant defying the nightly chill, creating comfort in a world that otherwise offered only ice. The image is telling. Frost was not just weather. It shaped imagination, poetry, and longing. So as you think of medieval sleep, remember the surreal beauty of those nights when cold decorated the very walls. To live in a castle was to share your chamber with ice. To wake each morning reminded that stone and frost were allies against your comfort. And yet, people endured. They endured by scraping ice from wash basins, by layering blankets until they could not move, by whispering charms and prayers against the frost, by dragging themselves from beds that felt like warm prisons to face mornings that were as harsh indoors as out. Now picture yourself not in a castle this time, but on the road, far from familiar chambers. Medieval travel was slow, arduous, and often perilous. When night fell, the problem of warmth became sharper still. Castles had fireplaces and tapestries. Peasants had family hearths and stables. But travelers, pilgrims, merchants, wandering knights, had only what they could find. That usually meant the inn. But banish the image of a snug country inn with polished beams and soft beds. The medieval inn was far rougher. A timber hall, smoky air, straw pallets shared by strangers. Guests might be packed 3 or 4 to a mattress, blankets stretched thin, privacy non-existent. Yet for all its discomfort, the inn offered one thing every traveler prized: heat. A central fire blazed in the main hall, and bodies crowded together magnified its warmth. A 15th century Italian traveler grumbled in his diary that the beds of northern inns were alive with vermin, and yet, in the same line, admitted with gratitude that at least I did not freeze. Imagine crawling into a straw mattress, squeezing between 2 men you have never met. The smell of ale, sweat, and damp wool pressing against your nose. Unpleasant, yes, but your toes do not blacken with frost. You wake sore, bitten by fleas perhaps, but alive. Some inns were so poorly supplied that guests slept not on pallets at all, but in stables. The idea shocks modern sensibilities, but for medieval travelers it was sometimes preferable. Horses and cattle radiated warmth. Their bodies turned a barn into a living furnace. Travelers curled up beside hay bales, cloaks pulled tight, listening to the rhythmic breathing of beasts. Pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago wrote frankly of choosing stalls deliberately, grateful for the heat, even if it came with dung and smell. In rural areas, hospitality followed older communal traditions. Villagers were expected, sometimes obliged, to offer shelter to strangers, especially pilgrims carrying badges or tokens. A peasant family might clear a spot by the hearth, spread a cloak on the floor, and welcome the guest into their warmth. You'd sleep shoulder to shoulder with strangers, stew still scenting the rafters, the fire glowing faintly. Generosity replaced luxury, but the effect was the same: survival. A French record from the 14th century describes communal inns where long wooden platforms lined the walls. Straw spread across them served as mattress, and dozens of travelers collapsed together: men, women, children, merchants, beggars, sleeping in tangled rows. To us, it sounds almost unbearable. To them, it was ordinary. The awkwardness of strangers pressing close paled before the comfort of body heat. Scholars still debate, were such inns, smoky and verminous though they were, actually warmer than noble chambers? Some argue yes, their low ceilings and crowded numbers retained heat better than vast, drafty halls. Others emphasize the dangers: theft, fleas, lice, contagion. Perhaps both are true. The weary traveler often had to choose between cold isolation and crowded discomfort. Now picture yourself in one of these inns. The door groans open. A wave of smoke and noise engulfs you. Ale sloshes, dogs bark, men argue in dialects you barely understand. The floor is dirt, damp from spilled drink and trampled boots. The innkeeper waves you toward a corner. You press onto the straw, strangers on either side. One smells sharply of garlic, another of horses. You tuck your cloak tight, lie flat, and close your eyes. Hours later, the noise dwindles. Snores replace laughter. The fire dies low, embers glowing faint red. The hall smells of smoke, sweat, and ale. A dog pads across the rushes, sniffs your cloak, and settles at your feet. Your body finally slackens. It is not luxury, but it is warmth. Even nobles faced this reality. A royal progression required armies of attendants, guards, clerks, courtiers, cooks. Inns overflowed quickly, and even kings lodged in monasteries, barns, or cramped chambers. Monarchs carried their own bedding, yes, feather mattresses, tapestries, curtains, but these could not change the fundamental fact: warmth was scarce, and travel stripped away privilege. A Burgundian courtier once complained bitterly of sharing fleas with peasants on the road, despite lodging in the best inn available. The line reminds us, cold erased many distinctions. All were reduced to the same human equation: bodies pressed together, smoke in the lungs, straw in the hair. In the tapestry of medieval sleep, remember the traveler. For him, each night was uncertain, each bed a gamble. Would it be a flea-ridden pallet, a stall with horses, a stranger's hearth, or if fortune smiled, a monastery guest hall? Whatever the bed, the goal was always the same: trap enough warmth to see another dawn. Yet not everyone succeeded. The medieval world left behind stories, half history, half legend, of those who lost the battle against frost. One grim chronicle from the 13th century tells of guards on a castle wall in Flanders. The night was bitter, the wind unrelenting. By dawn, their comrades found them still upright, spears clutched in hands frozen stiff, bodies encased in ice. They had frozen where they stood, statues of men. The chronicler did not write with pity but with awe. Winter itself was a weapon of war, no less cruel than sword or arrow. Picture the eerie sight: a row of soldiers glazed in frost, torches flickering against their lifeless faces, the battlements glittering with rime, the silence heavier than any battle cry. Other tales are softer, more personal, but no less haunting. A noblewoman in Burgundy wrote of her Italian cousin visiting in winter. He trembled all night in her chamber, begged aloud for dawn, confessed he had never known such cold. He survived, of course, but the story was retold with mocking laughter, his weakness ridiculed, even as everyone privately recognized the terror of nights that seemed endless. From Scandinavia comes a folk story of a bride who entered her new husband's castle and collapsed from the shock of the cold chamber. Villagers whispered she had been cursed by the ice spirits of the north. Whether she died of illness, exposure, or imagination, the tale endured. It became a warning. Even noble marriages could falter against stone walls and winter winds. Scholars remain divided on these accounts. Were they exaggerated for drama, transforming hardship into legend? Or do they reflect real losses to frostbite and hypothermia in an age when no insulation shielded the body from stone? Some argue chroniclers inflated the tales for moral lessons. Others see them as starkly accurate reports of a climate harsher than our own. Now picture yourself in a great hall, hearing such tales retold. The fire crackles, shadows dance across carved beams, men nod gravely, women cross themselves, children lean in with wide eyes. The story of guards frozen at their posts is told not only as history, but as a parable. Winter is the great equalizer, a foe no sword can slay. The laughter at the trembling Italian cousin and the whispered tale of the frost-cursed bride, the solemn account of frozen centuries, all remind you that sleep in the Middle Ages was never simple. To close your eyes was to court not just dreams, but danger. Expanded section. Fire as guardian and tyrant. The fire burns low. Shadows stretch long across the walls, bending and shifting as if alive. Children huddle near the hearth, wide-eyed, listening to the creak of logs and the voice of an old retainer. His tale is not of shining knights or glorious battles, but of a man undone by cold. He tells them of a knight, proud, armored, and strong, who perished in his sleep because he trusted too few blankets. The children clutch their cloaks tighter, their eyes darting to the glowing embers. The message is plain. Take the cold seriously, or it will take you. These stories were not only for fright, they were warnings carved into memory. Firelight, flickering across small faces, turned such tales into lessons passed down generation by generation. Just as much as armor or swordsmanship, knowing how to survive the night was a skill of life and death. Travelers, too, wrote with the same tone of caution. Pilgrims trudging across mountain passes recorded companions who did not wake, their bodies stiff, discovered only when spring thawed the snow. Some were found curled on their sides, hands folded as if in prayer, frozen mid-dream. Soldiers on campaign told of comrades who slipped into slumber in their bedrolls and never rose again, cloaks frozen hard as shields. The line between sleep and death blurred dangerously when the temperature dropped. To close your eyes was to gamble. Blankets, fires, charms, and prayers, these were the stakes. Survival was the prize. The sensory detail of those nights cuts sharp across centuries. The sting of frost on skin exposed for just a moment too long. Fingers swelling numb until they no longer obeyed. Toes that ached as though gnawed by wolves. And in the mind, the dread, an unspoken question. If I let myself drift, will I wake again? And yet, alongside these grim tales, there were stories of endurance. Peasants boasted of winters survived in cottages where bodies, animals, and hearth together made survival possible. They spoke with pride of their closeness, family as shield against cold. Nobles, on the other hand, celebrated feasts and hunts in midwinter, symbols that their wealth and provisions had conquered the season. In both cases, survival itself became a kind of victory, a badge of resilience. This duality explains why the legends of frozen nights and trembling travelers persisted. They were not mere entertainment. They reminded every listener that castles, for all their might, were not invulnerable. Stone walls stopped arrows and engines of war, but not the invisible army of frost. Winter was the great equalizer. In the end, lords and peasants alike were brought to the same battlefield, night and cold, and forced to fight it with the same weapons: blankets, fires, prayers, and companionship. So as you imagine medieval sleep, hold both truths together: the tragedies of those who succumbed to frost and the quiet triumphs of those who endured. Every story carried a lesson. Respect the night. Guard against the cold. Never assume survival is guaranteed. At last, in imagination, you turn again to the hearth, the true symbol that bound every medieval sleeper. The fire was never just a tool. It was the household's heart, the boundary between life and death on winter nights. Look at it. Light and shadow wrestle across stone walls, the flames creating guardians out of flickering silhouettes. They dance and twist like spirits, warding off the abyss beyond the walls. To sleep in a castle was to live in dialogue with fire. You feared it, needed it, depended on it. You could not survive without it. Every sense was dominated by the hearth. The snap of oak logs echoed through chambers like a heartbeat. Sparks shot upward, glowing trails that vanished into the cavernous chimney. Smoke carried the resin of pine and the bitterness of half-burned bark, clinging to tapestries and hair. The warmth radiated unevenly, face flushed, back chilled, a paradox of relief and discomfort. The hearth was a tyrant as much as a savior. It kept you alive, but on its terms. For nobles, the fire's blaze was a mark of status. A roaring hearth declared wealth, the ability to strip forests bare, to order servants to feed logs endlessly, to maintain flames long after peasants' embers had gone dark. Some households even appointed dedicated fire wardens, servants whose sole duty was to keep the embers alive through the night. To let the hearth grow cold was no mere accident. It was negligence, even disgrace. And yet the poorest also revered fire. Peasants squatted on earthen floors around small hearths, huddled with family and livestock. Their fires were humble, fed by sticks, dung, or peat, not carved oak. But they laughed, prayed, and told stories around it just the same. A fire meant life, no matter how meager. Close your eyes and place yourself before one now. The flames hiss as sap bursts in the wood. The heat brushes your cheeks but leaves your back icy. Smoke thickens the air, makes your eyes water, settles in your hair. Behind you, the chamber still feels cavernous and cruel. But in front of you, in this fragile circle of glow, the world feels safe. The hearth was paradox embodied. Giver of life, thief of forests, provider of warmth, maker of smoke, friend and tyrant. Peasants knew it, nobles knew it. And so every medieval sleeper, whether in a great hall or a thatched hut, measured their night by the hearth's mercy. Because in the end, medieval sleep was not about conquering the cold. It was about bargaining with it. In both castle and cottage, the fire was more than warmth. It was a magnet, pulling people close. Villagers in Germany once described circling the hearth before bed, stretching their hands toward the flames, whispering blessings as if the sparks themselves were holy. They did not see the fire as mere fuel. They saw it as companion, guardian, spirit. Every crackle was a prayer spoken in wood and flame. Historians today still debate how far that reverence went. Was it only survival instinct dressed in ritual, a habit born of desperation? Or did medieval people truly believe fire carried their hopes into the night, warding spirits and frost alike? Perhaps both are true. Perhaps when you live close to danger, every practical act naturally becomes sacred. The fire was survival, but also symbol. It was warmth and worship, necessity and meaning. Now let yourself step once more into your imagined chamber. It is night again. The bed curtains are drawn tight. Blankets pile high across your body, heavy as armor. Outside, wind lashes against the towers, pressing its weight into the stone. Snow hisses along the shutters, 1,000 needles of ice rattling against wood. But in the great hearth, embers still glow. Not fierce now, not blazing. They are quiet, pulsing red, a low heartbeat of light. Their glow slips faintly through cracks in the curtains, painting the chamber with the gentlest firelight. You close your eyes, hearing the sigh of flame, knowing it is the thin line between your warmth and the world's winter. The sensory details gather around you like a quilt. The taste of smoke lingers on your tongue. The musk of wool fills your nose. The steady weight of fur presses across your chest. At your feet, a dog curls tighter, its warmth a silent gift. In the hush, a whispered prayer drifts through your mind, words half remembered, meant to guard your rest. You drift slowly into the edge of dreams, knowing what every medieval sleeper knew, that sleep was never given freely. It had to be fought for, earned, and guarded with fire, with ritual, with closeness. Castles were fortresses against men, but never against winter. What saved their inhabitants was not stone or steel, but resilience, invention, community. To survive the night meant layering cloth, sharing heat, burning fuel, whispering charms. Against the endless cold, humanity itself became the true fire. Now let the pace soften further. The embers glow faint, no longer fierce but gentle, like coals resting after labor. The chamber is quiet. Outside, the rush of wind dulls into a distant murmur, like the sea heard through thick walls. Inside, blankets press heavier, protective, as if urging you downward into rest. The struggles of the night, cold drafts, watchful fires, coughing servants, restless animals, all drift away as though you have drawn a curtain across the world. Your breathing slows. Each inhale tastes of faint smoke and wool. Each exhale dissolves into stillness. The castle itself seems to sleep with you. Its stones hold silence like a promise. The rafters creak softly, but no storm intrudes. You are safe in your cocoon of cloth and fur. The dog at your feet sighs and shifts once, then goes still. The last candle gutters, its flame bowing, and darkness folds gently around you like another layer of blanket. Yes, the cold is still there. It always is. But now you no longer fight it. Like the peasants, like the nobles, like the monks and travelers, you accept it. Sleep is not victory. Sleep is truce. Fragile, temporary, but enough. With the long night, your body grows heavier. Your mind unravels into softness. Thoughts loosen, then dissolve into shapes, then colors, then nothing at all. The medieval world, its stone walls, its frost, its smoke, drifts backward, fading like frost melting in the first rays of dawn. What remains is calm. You are warm enough, safe enough, tired enough. And so the story closes. The hearth flickers, its glow dim but faithful. The bed holds you, heavy and reassuring, and the long winter night carries you gently into dreams. Rest now as they once did. Rest with resilience wrapped around you. Rest with warmth borrowed from flame, from cloth, from faith. Rest in the quiet knowledge that humanity has always survived the night. Sweet dreams.